Perished World. It was an early access strategy simulation game that our protagonist Choi Sienwin enjoyed very much. Not only did he enjoy it for his entertainment and free time, but he also became a master at it. In each match in Perished World, 32 players acted as gods whose task was to develop the various races, such as humans, elves, orcs, and the others, into a modern civilization and fight each other. And now the match was coming to its culmination, and the armies of the two remaining players clashed in one last desperate battle for first place on a battlefield engulfed in flames and smoke. The two armies prepared for battle, awaiting the command of their deities. Their banners unfurled in the wind, and their spears glistened in the glow of the flames. The decisive battle was about to begin. As soon as the command onwards was heard from above, the armies came into motion, shouting the name of their deity, Nebula, which was the game nickname of the protagonist. They rushed to the attack. The opposing army also rushed to attack, wanting to defeat Nebula's continued hegemony in the name of their deity. Choi Sienwin had been undefeated for 11 months now, and if he could win today, he would become the champion for 12 consecutive months. This battle was nothing more than a small skirmish, and the victory in this entire war depended on the strategy chosen and realized by the player, controlling the entire race. Each of the armies was controlled by a real player, and each of them chose a different development path for their civilizations. The orc race developed their physical strength magic and rapidly increased their population, while the human race, under Nebula's control, chose the path of technology and already had firearms, even cannons that seemingly should not have left a chance to their primitive opponents. But thanks to magic, things were not so hopeless for the orcs, and their battle mages managed to stop the cannonballs flying at them. However, this was just the beginning, and Nebula was already preparing to release their next secret weapon. It was an air force that would wipe out the enemy army from the face of this planet. This was certainly a problem for his opponent, but he had something to answer for, and with a few taps on his virtual keyboard, he summoned an equally devastating weapon. Thanks to his specialization in magic, he was able to summon a multitude of lightning bolts from the heavens, which simply vaporized the enemy army. As battle after battle went on, it was like a chess game where only a well-thought-out strategy in knowledge of his opponent and his strategy could guarantee victory. Gradually, Nebula reached a level of technology comparable to the period of the end of World War II, which allowed him to use massive airstrikes, wiping out all enemy armies on the ground. And looking at it all from his monitor, he decided that everything he needed was ready and he could finish the game, not for nothing. After all, he had spent so much resources and time on research. For this, he was going to use one of his strongest weapons, the nuclear strike. All he had to do was confirm the nuclear strike. In the name of his deity at his command, the nuclear missiles were immediately launched, and a multitude of intercontinental ballistic missiles with dozens of nuclear warheads rose into the air from his base at once. All of his nuclear missiles were launched simultaneously and flew toward the enemy base. The terrified and unaware orcs could only point their fingers at the sky and stare at the death flying at them. But the player leading them was ready even for such a move, and only chuckling, asked Nebula in the voice chat if he hoped that he was not prepared for this right. Gathering his divine power into a fist and clutching his scepter tighter, he activated a defense spell immediately after rockets from missile defense systems were launched from his nation's territory, which should have successfully intercepted Sun 1's nuclear missiles. But even that was within his calculations. The enemy's missile defenses could not keep up with him and his brilliant plan for victory. However, he had to admit that his opponent was well prepared and wasn't a loser at all. While the enemy's missile defense was shooting down nuclear missiles one after another, and the perished world sky was illuminated by powerful explosions, Nebula moved on to the next point of his plan and launched another missile, which was bigger than the others. It did not fly straight to the enemy base like the others, but flew straight into open space. There all the stages of the rocket, which had already fulfilled the role of the gas booster, separated, and only the warhead remained. It flew straight, vertically down on the capital of the enemy empire, or rather, on the main temple, where the emperor was hiding and praying to his deity. When the Orc Emperor heard the news of nuclear missiles being launched towards his country, he went to pray in the temple. In real life, in a non-hierarchical society, a ruler praying to a god in the face of danger to his country might seem ridiculous or even pathetic, but in the perished world, it was different. His opponent was hoarding as much faith as possible instead of putting resources into research while Nebula developed his nuclear weapons. In Perished World, the players acted as gods. They could intervene to some degree in the affairs of the race or nation under their rule, and through this, they sought to spread their influence among the rest of the Perished World's creatures and gain fears. These followers then produced a resource called faith, which allowed the players to perform miracles to protect their followers and keep them safe. This was why his opponent originally chose orcs as his primary race, because they multiplied quickly and could produce a lot of faith. However, even such an unexpected and ingenious attack did not surprise his opponent, who looked at his followers, only marveled at their persistence in prayer, the energy and power gained from their faith. He transformed into another spell, and clouds of blue smoke began to surround the approaching missile. In an instant, it all turned into a huge fist that grabbed and stopped the missile. It was the first of a huge orc-like creature, hundreds of meters tall. Watching all of this, the opponent started laughing at Nebula and reminded him that here in the Perished World, faith always brings results. He was sure that victory was in his pocket, and with such an unlimited resource of loyal followers, he was in no danger. Sunwin just chuckled at this. Even so, he was still bored. Even though his opponent was not bad and used a good strategy known among players as Holy Org strategy, his opponent continued to laugh, confident in his victory, asking if he could see it. His avatar was now right next to his summoned orc. He proudly announced that it was his own freshly optimized Holy Orc strategy. This player was the second-ranked player on their server, and he was now confident of his victory. So he suggested that someone just give up looking at his relaxed and laughing opponent on the monitor. Sunwon realized why he was only the second-ranked player on their server and had never gone higher. The reason was because he was overconfident. However, his strategy wasn't perfect, and Sunwon was very familiar with it. Orcs were chosen as the main race to rapidly increase the population, and as the believers increased, the resources of the faith were also rapidly accumulated. The missing science, technology, and culture were conquered by invasion. It wasn't a bad strategy, constantly receiving good reviews, as the large amount of accumulated faith and the large number of orcs gave an advantage in warfare. However, he knew how to counter such a strategy. Although orcs are an easy race to recruit, it's quite a feat to have gathered so much faith already. However, against his own strategy, orcs were difficult to counter, as he had chosen the skies as his battlefield so that he could freely prepare kinetic attacks. Sunwon respected his opponent and thought that his attempt at preparing a spirit apostle was quite good, but still his opponent was too obvious. And thanks to the fact that Sunwon ruled the heavens and was constantly developing his technology, he was able to create and launch into space an artificial intelligence-controlled military satellite made from ancient relics, utilizing the endless space above his enemies' heads. He was able to place a satellite there with a secret weapon, giant metal tungsten rods, which, although they contained no explosives, weighed 10 tons each, and as they began to fall, they moved very slowly at first, but soon gravity accelerated them to the point where they began to glow red-hot through the atmosphere. His opponent, looking at all this, was not on a joke, surprised to such a thing. He was certainly not ready. He could only swear and curse his ingenious opponent, who first threw nuclear missiles at him and now was going to finish him off with a kinetic bombardment from space. He gave a desperate command to his holy orc to block at least the rod that was flying straight at the temple with the emperor inside. But Sunman looked at his pathetic attempts and knew that none of this would work, even if it was just a few tungsten rods. Once they entered the atmosphere, the rods would accelerate so much that the force of their impact would be comparable to a nuclear weapon, and cumulative acceleration of gravity will add up. Despite the stork's best efforts, there was nothing he could do about it, and the rod simply passed through him like a knife through butter, feeling no resistance, and it was too late for his opponent to do anything about it, because once they reached the ground, the rods brought about Armageddon. The entire capital of his empire was destroyed, and the entire population wiped out. But most importantly, one of the rods hit the Orc Emperor, and nothing could protect him. Even the countless protective spells cast on him were not enough, and he was simply crushed and dropped his staff of power, along with the imperial palace. The underground temple has collapsed too, and now all the faith that his opponent had been building was shattered and gone. He was immediately surrounded by many notices that his spells were losing power and disappearing for lack of faith, and when faith fades, her apostle disappeared with it. Now his adversary was confused and unable to control and defend his civilization. The holy Orc apostles scattered, and the enemy capital, major cities and infrastructure began to explode like fireworks from nuclear missiles. Eventually, the enemy simply surrendered, and Nebula was once again declared the winner. After the match was over, Sunwin even thanked his opponent for a good game, but he didn't want to admit defeat and desperately asked for one more game together for a rematch. He was confident that he could win this time. Sunwon tiredly looked at the monitor as the requests for another game appeared one after another, but he wasn't interested and just left the match for good. Now he wondered why his opponent did not surrender immediately, but wasted so much of his time. It even seemed to him at first that his opponent had an ace up his sleeve, but in the end, he didn't have much to show for it at the end. In the end, he didn't see anything new in this match, but it didn't matter. After all, by winning this match, he was able to complete an achievement that required a player to stay in the top 1 rankings for 12 months. And just when he was about to go rest, a notification suddenly came, which caught his attention. At first, he thought it was someone texting him at such a late hour, and he was already wondering who it was. But when he clicked on the notific greeting appeared in front of him. It turned out that he was the only player who had completed all the achievements so far. But then, he wondered if this might mean that they would cut off his access to beta testing, because that would be unfair. The next message dispelled all his doubts. The beta testing period was really over, and the game was about to be open to everyone, but thanks to his achievements, he had a chance to try out the game before it was released to everyone. He was a bit surprised by this offer, but still, he liked the game a lot and wanted to see what the real game would be like. So, when a notification popped up asking him to enter the game, Sunwon decided to try it, without a doubt, and clicked the yes button. Suddenly, everything around him went dark, and he began to fall into the void surrounded by streams of binary code. Sunwon thought he had lost consciousness, but that was not the case. When his vision cleared, the night sky, which he had thought was pitch black, was not quite empty, but filled with many stars. He looked around and realized he was in the middle of some kind of space temple. But then after some thought, he realized that it looked more like a ruin. Looking around, he wondered if he was dreaming. After all, he looked exactly like his in-game avatar. Suddenly, as if reading his mind, a voice sounded from behind him, assuring him that it wasn't a dream. It turned out to be a woman wearing a hooded robe, and her face was barely visible. She Annunciation, an astonishing achievement that our protagonist had also been chosen and called his nickname Nebula. To begin with, she decided to introduce herself. Her name was Alden Wen. First asked her the logical question, how did she know his name? But more than that, he was interested in something else that caught his attention, a set of blurry shadows that stood nearby. He wondered who they were. The hooded woman replied that she was wondering if any of the players would know each other. So, for there to be fair game, everyone received a mask. She went on to say that she knew everyone here was wondering what was ahead of them. So, she suggested getting straight to the point. She raised her hands high in the air, pointing to a planet that looked suspiciously like Earth, although it looked that way at first glance. Sun, one realized it wasn't. He had simply seen this planet too many times, and now he simply couldn't confuse it with anything else. This was the perished world. The mysterious woman solemnly announced that here and now, in the boundlessness of perished world, all the players present would become true gods. After all, the game they had all played before, Perished World, was based on the real world, and all these countless matches were practiced games before the one that was about to begin. This was where they would become true gods. On the platform were dozens of humanoid creatures who stood in groups without dropping a word. They were all surrounded by an impenetrable darkness that created the right atmosphere. Sunwon couldn't hear any sound, but he could feel the vibrations with his microfibers. There were even people that stood alone. Perhaps they were just embarrassed to socialize. Perished. World isn't just a world that exists in games, reasoned the guy analyzing the situation. He got into this planet was just like the regular Earth, the same blue ball flying through space, except that unlike the original, it had been abandoned by the gods because of the sad events of the past on this planet. A once brilliant civilization flourished. The various races of creatures lived in harmony. The race of armed foxes saddled the white weasels that acted as horses here. Orcs worked alongside elves and platypuses in laboratories for the benefit of their comrades. All was at peace. However, not everything was so smooth. For reasons unknown, the gods had abandoned this place, having the bodies of the dragons on this land. They felt threatened for their lives and flew off in an unknown direction, erasing their traces behind them. The time for new gods had come. All the players gathered around the heavy granite table where Aldean stood and narrated the rules of participation. The Perished World game was created to find suitable new candidates for this planet. Only once, tried out of boredom, could any player become a god. It is essentially similar to the original Perished World game. At first, only inferior beings that have lost everything in their lives will trust the player. But if you are lucky enough to increase the number of believers, there is a huge chance to become the one and only god of this planet. The world will be only yours, and no one will dare to argue with the Supreme Being. God dares to do whatever his heart desires. All desires that you have ever dreamed of can be realized. This is a possibility only for the God of that world. It was a wonderful offer that beckoned with its possibilities, enticing greedy people. Sunwon nodded, but it was noticeable that Aldean wasn't saying something. What happens if I surrender here? The young man asked, wanting to hear as many details as possible. However, if one surrenders now, one will simply go back to one's daily life as a payment for the game. The person will lose all memories of this place. But what happens if one surrenders in the middle of a challenge? There is no such clause. It was simply impossible to give up. What happens if I'm defeated by another god? The guy kept on fixing the skull of the ungulate on his head. In that case, the loser would meet a divine end. The watchers will welcome such a spectacle. It will be great entertainment for them. This was the answer that Sunwon had expected. If it was a game where the winner takes all, it made sense that the participants would have to risk their lives. And if it was a competition in the real world, like the Perished World game, then it might be necessary to risk more than just lives. Divine ending, no matter how you look at it, only meant one thing: death. They aren't squeamish about killing people for risking their lives. Extinction threatens everyone. There's only one winner. There was simply no reason for the guy here to give up Sun. One wanted to ask a few more questions, but Aldean reached out his hand and stopped him. Well, now it was time to choose, shifting the cardboard cards in his hands. The man asked everyone who wanted to surrender to inform the organizers right now, but for those who wished to accept the challenge, he laid the cards face up. The remaining contestants begin their journey by choosing a small area of land. This is really an event that is so similar to the game of the same name, meaning that the beginning consists of choosing a small area of favorable land to rule. Looking around, it seemed that some people started whispering. It was abundantly clear that they wanted to give up. 5 individuals immediately decided to leave the competition. They cared about their skin. 5 individuals immediately decided to leave the competition. They cared about their skin. Apparently, the starting number of people was equal to the maximum number of participants in the game, which was 30. All individuals they met at the final number of people was already 27, and a ledge coalition, but it would be much better if half of them were eliminated as soon as possible. Okay, you can choose first. Aldine turned to the protagonist, an unexpected decision for the guy. He hadn't expected such honors. See, and when only shrugged his shoulders, the order of selection didn't matter because the cards were good. It's the randomness in their existence, just like in the game, have said again after the first chance to test his fate. It seemed like they had taken the ranking order into consideration. Choosing the first card he came across, he flipped its blue surface to the bottom. Though he knew the details of each territory presented by the game, however, he expected to have better luck. As with the map, toe circle of runes lit up under the guy's feet, which instantly held him to the designated location. Once the territory and land were determined, the players had to decide on the first species and tribe. The planet was truly beautiful, so it was each of its continents together or apart. Although the third continent was the largest, it didn't have as many resources as the first, nor didn't have as good a climate, as Sam said it was home to various races and monsters, as well as many ruins that house special in-game abilities. Depending on how one used them, they could become an advantage or a disadvantage. The protagonist promptly scanned the territory given to him and identified all the species and tribes. The land was a peninsula located in the eastern part of the third continent, only past the trees that grew in the mountainous area. Brief rocks in the water and watched the beautiful blue butterflies that resembled Morpho. She did not take her eyes off the seemingly potential food, but the frog was not interested in it. The fish that swam beneath her feet were much more appealing. Diving for a perch, the toad caught the prey with its hands splashing around the neighborhood. The prey was very large, and other fish. It was clear from their voices that they were pleased or tainted with fish. Turning to the blue butterflies flying by, they concluded that such a species had not been seen in their neighborhood before. But are they important now? They weren't going to eat the nasty bugs. Sitting on a huge chair, Sunwind, during his wing friends, pondering the frogmen, they lived on a small area of insects with the lowest win rate, but that only depended on the spelling. Although it was backwards compatible with birds, it was very even useful in the beginning. That our point was on the eastern continent. This meant that battles were not frequent in the beginning. The advantages gained through early learning only meant that it would be extremely difficult to implement an aggressive strategy. In this sense, a race that beats insects was more than suitable for the beginning of the game, like those frogmen, for example. But what made the guy laugh was the number of tribes, about 500 individuals of different species, was a large group, was actually defined as a first tribe. The pastoral camp culture, equal to the level of faith they possess, depend on the career that they will base on how much they believe in God and entrust their hearts to Him on whether they truly rely on Him. You don't have to walk down a difficult path from the beginning, where a measly 10 believers will do nothing to help. Then I'm going to choose not to leave any impact on this group of frogmen. And anyway, what can be done where there are no bodies of water until a high level of technological development is achieved? No action can be taken. And what about the other groups of cronies? The young man asked himself, looking at another screen. A group of creatures of different ages were walking across the hot desert. They were lizards. They eat insects till their skin was blue and covered with spots of different diameters. There were about 30 of them in total, too few to be called a small tribe, and they were probably all blood relatives. They were characterized by a high survival rate. These creatures could survive here without water. Even though the number of individuals had decreased, it was even for the best. In this race, there were many sickly, a few elderly lizards, and one object was almost crawling to the end of the pack while dying. It's understandable he's from the original group. Perhaps he had been pushed lower in rank in the power struggle. However, there was little to gain. The more he feels abandoned by this world, the harder and more tired he feels. If he wants revenge, life, and other benefits, he will believe not only in God, but also in Satan. Just a small miracle like finding a god, but he was too fragile a creature. Such faith would not last long. However, it was much better than frogs, so the choice settled on lizard men. All the weaker individuals weaved to the back of their small pack, especially the injured lizard man lagged behind. The wound healed poorly due to poor nutrition and became inflamed with every step, which was slow due to weakness. The pack was barely surviving on their wanderings. They were weakened, the already thin for their build, the creature's cheeks sunken in and ribs began to show. Not everyone could hunt, and there were only small birds and stray animals in such deserts. "Hey, look, there's a gazelle," shouted one of the pack in surprise. They did not believe in the reality of what was happening. In front of them lay a wounded ungulates that was waiting for its death. Its leg was broken, so it could not run away. The crowd all rushed at the poor animal trying to grab a tidbit. One prey, and about 30 hungry. How long it had been since they'd eaten meat. Without tools, they tore the poor gazelle apart, spilling fresh blood onto the heated sand. This event was clearly not for the old and wounded, where they could not compete with the strength of healthy tribesmen. The lizard men ate the fresh meat with quick gusto, slurping loudly all around. It was gone in an instant, but there were still bones to nibble. The marrow in the tubular bones was also usable. One of the tribe wanted to try the delicacy, but it was not to be. The girl took away the leftovers. They had had enough something to leave for those unable to hunt. She gathered all the bones into a pile and so kindly took them to the other hungry people. It's a good thing to be hungry, considering they've been starving for days. It was a gift from heaven. Saliva dripping in every direction. They knocked on the bones and drank the liquid from them. They grabbed them as if they were the last chance to live. Only the deeply wounded lizard sat by itself behind the rock, grudgingly gnawing on a bone. The gnats flying around the wound made him a little uneasy, but it was bearable compared to the pain he endured, recorrect, and took it for granted. Clearly, those who hunted had to eat more meat. Those who could not hunt should have been grateful for even being given leftovers. After all, the group could have simply left the weak and wounded to reduce the number of hungry mouths, but they didn't do that, at least not yet, while the others tended to the marrow. The main pack spoke of the wounded asking JL if she was really satisfied with everything, but whether pretending or not, she really didn't know what they were talking about. She questioned what they meant. The most unceremonious man gave his opinion. He didn't care if they were old or young. But that guy was going to die soon. Everyone knew that very well, for his wound was festering. In fact, he should have been dead by now. No one knew what contributed to it, but he kept up the good work and kept up with everyone. Many people survived because Rat Crack blocked the saber-toothed tiger. He was the only one to face the predator when everyone else turned and ran. Thanks to him, other than his wounds, the group was unharmed. If it hadn't been for the lad, many would have been killed or injured, and at worst, the entire group could have collapsed. They were already a pack that had been kicked out of the larger tribe for their weakness and illnesses. So without Rack Rack, it would have been hard for them to keep themselves alive. He even managed to live longer than everyone expected. Everyone knows this and appreciate it. However, still most individuals would die. There really wasn't enough food. They had to be honest with themselves. With this kind of life, natural selection played an important role. There was no point in giving all the most nutritious food to the sick. It would just prolong their lives for another day. Taking a break near a small rock, the lizard men settled down to sleep in groups. The full moon illuminated all the surroundings like a lamp in a child's room. Rat Crack alone slept by himself. Holding on to his already restless sleep is disturbed by what happened when above his ear. A familiar morpho butterfly against Canadian shining even brighter in the moonlight. It came closer and closer to his face, forcing him to pay attention to it. Rising a little, the lizard man looked at its behavior. She did not fly away, but only fluttered over his head. She seemed to be beckoning to him, calling him to follow her to the mountain near where they had stopped. And he agreed, standing up as quietly as possible. The other tribesmen heard the shuffling of Rack Rack's feet and woke the others. Their comrade was going somewhere. They watched him. Some even thought he had finally decided to leave the group, taking such a heavy burden off their shoulders. The whole tribe agreed to watch him for now. What was he going to do, climbing higher and higher up the cliff? Meanwhile, he climbed further and further up, as if mesmerized by a butterfly. It was hard, but he didn't give up. Was this his crazy fantasy and its death agony? He was the only one who responded to the call of the scaly wing. Maybe it was true. But if what he was seeing right in front of him was true, that meant it was real. Following the butterfly farther and farther up, his surprise was unparalleled. His eyes rounded to the size of a huge plate, and his jaw hum open insects. A huge swarm of bugs that crawled all over each other created an extension of the mountain. They didn't they didn't dodge. As if mesmerized, they climbed around, determined to become easy food themselves. This amount of food made his thoughts clouded and his breathing hitched. He was hungry. This amount would be enough for the entire pack. The group of lizard men, 1102 to 1, experienced a miracle. Seeing the system message in front of him, someone felt relieved. Just as Aldine had said, the interface was the same as in the perished world game. In the insect's small area, one could create or control insects using the faith points. Naturally, creating and controlling them was different from the game. The observers finally recognized it as a miracle. Now the guy could breathe out a sigh of relief. "Thank God," whispered through his mask. The first step had been taken. The amount of bugs sent by the protagonist was enough to feed the entire group for days to come. Then the guy's next step was to ensure that different swarms of beetles would steadily appear day by day. The lizard men themselves announced that miracle by addressing the butterfly as if they knew she was the one behind everything. Indeed, people with high willpower could take care of everything on their own. However, why would they do so at this point? Intelligent beings knew that miracles were amazing, and after they were repeated, the lizard men would attribute these miracles to some creature. They realized that such occurrences were not random, but inevitable. A beetle on the arm of one of the tribes sat quietly, crossing its legs. The rare Crack tribe recognized the divinity of the nameless beetle god, but why a beetle and not a butterfly? Beetle god, a ridiculous name for a beetle, thought someone. No one seemed to have a great name. At first, just as an intelligent creature develops civilization and technology, a god's name changes to. They might have noticed his divinity after the miracle, but it wasn't enough. Still, this tribe will become very even important to the protagonist. If everything went according to someone's plan, he would be able to achieve what he wanted with the next miracle. Of course, this also applied to the wounded tribe protector. A strange blue butterfly accompanied them day after day wherever they went. Looking into the distance where it flew, Ratcrack began to see illusions again still. This time, he should have followed her. Unlike the rest of the group, he was suspicious of the strange swarm of bugs that appeared out of nowhere. The whole swarm rejoiced at finding food. It was like a celebration for them every time. Ratcrack, are you going to go after your illusion right away? As the lizard man to his leader. However, winter was coming soon, but the bugs kept appearing from colder directions. Not a good thing. If they traveled in that direction, it wouldn't be long before they would freeze to death. Lizard men had learned how to survive the winter, but the blood of their cold-blooded ancestors still remained with them. In winter, their bodies became sluggish. Food was in short supply, and they could only travel during the day when the sun rose. As a result, many of them starved to death, and so at the very least, they needed to make their way through the wilderness to find a forest with plenty of firewood to keep warm. Under such circumstances, it would be wise to ignore the fantasy now, since that was unsafe not only for the sick, but also for the healthy. The best option would be to reach in another direction. However, Rare Crack didn't they should do that. There was nothing in this empty, wild, sandy field. Was there some purpose to the fantasies he saw? No one knew about that. But right now, he had no choice but to follow the butterfly Sunwind, calmly watch the actions of his favorite. There were few believers since this was just the beginning. There was nothing he could do. Specifically, he had heard too much about faith. Aside from Rockrack, he was skeptical of all miracles. Nothing could be done about him yet. You had to be above level 2 to bless him. The boy walked bravely with a child on a signed Brerezu, leading the entire pack behind him. If only they had more faith in their god. Following the butterfly, they climbed higher and higher up the mountain. They could have a future they could never imagine just because of their faith. As they climbed to the maximum height, they saw an indescribable landscape. But still, it didn't really matter now, because now he had to focus on not getting caught. Listen up, everyone shouted the lizard man to his group. The nameless bug god had led them to a sacred place. This was truly the promised land. Here in their green bushes could be seen for a few plants grew in the dry desert. But as they climbed the hill, a wide spring of water came into view. Dense bushes and trees surrounded the spring, from which small waterfalls and streams flowed. A crowd of dockers opened their mouths to gaze at such beauty. This was the respite they had been dreaming of all these days. Now they wouldn't have to think about food and lodging. They had everything. The pack rejoiced inexorably at this miracle. Now they would survive. Rack had been right after all. There were more believers. Sunwind grinned as he watched the subjects. The notifications flashed before his eyes, informing him that the divinity level had been raised to second. The level of the small beetle realm had increased to second. At first, the level of divinity only played a role in increasing the accumulation limit of faith, and thus there was no need to pay attention to it right away. What was important was that the small beetle realm had increased. Even though it had only reached the second level, it could now bestow blessings. Blessing beetles was now a possibility. But did anyone know what he wanted? The protagonist spoke to himself, but as if addressing Rack offering to be his priest, let him deliver his will to his people and blessings to help him do so. A bright light shone upon the lizard men leader, bestowing his powers upon him. However, no one saw it, but someone felt it. Evening quickly covered the continent, so they split into groups. Some hunted well and brought plenty of food, some set up camp, and the rest of the cooking. Cooked food was much tastier than cold and raw food. So after they had eaten enough, they went to bed for the first time in a long time, not worrying about anything. Only the fireflies did not sleep. One brave beetle was not afraid to fly up to the lizard and sat on his shoulder. A quiet voice called out to read Crack, waking him from his sleep. When he opened his eyes, he didn't realize where he was. He was sitting on his knees in a snow-white void. It seemed more like a dream than reality. Butterflies of different sizes were circling around him, attracting his attention every time they tried to land on his nose. A certain voice kept calling him over and over again. In front of him stood a lizard man in a row whose appearance was hard to see. He was pulling his clawed paw towards Crack. Would he be able to withstand his hand? The unknown man asked, looking up from beneath his hood. But could he be trusted? What did he want from a mere outcast from the settlement? The hand changed its position in space. Now it was pointing at him. The weight in his hands, but the boy to his senses, leaving him bewildered. Before he knew it, he was holding the skull of a water buffalo. It had giant horns sticking out of its head. Its eye sockets and nasal openings were empty, and its upper jaw teeth were still firmly in place. Rack handed the water buffalo skull to the lizard man, and the latter placed the skull on his head. Before him stood the very real nameless bug god. At this, the dream became vague and then disappeared altogether. The chief woke up all the people from the morning and said that he had had a dream. After the story, everyone realized what the deity wanted from them, namely to sacrifice a buffalo to hunt the buffalo. They would have to go deep into the forest, which was too much of a risk. Jael said. Her objections made sense, but whoever had brought them to the sanctuary wanted an offering. No one wanted to put their tribesmen in danger. Hunting water buffalo is so dangerous that you have to risk your life. Perhaps all the hunters of the pack would have to come forward. However, who would then protect the remaining weak members of the group? Jael kept hitting the mark with her remarks. It wasn't for nothing that she used to be the chief. They couldn't put the whole pack in danger, Crack said, gripping the stone spear in his hands. He had originally intended to go alone to most of the pack. That would only mean suicide. Many began to discourage him. You couldn't catch a water buffalo by yourself. It was impossible. However, he wasn't head over heels either. God blessed him. If he wanted, he would get him even a bull or a lion. No one understood what he was saying. Some even thought he was mad. It was really incredible. When Rat Crack woke up, his wound was completely healed, and all of his shoulders were covered in black scales like buck shells. Even Jail recognized that these were strange events, but that was no reason to go buffalo hunting on his own. Of course, that wasn't all. The real reason was different. After the blessing, not only had he healed and gained mass, he had also become many times stronger. In front of the oasis was an old palm tree that leaned sideways. Standing on one leg, he threw a spear with a perfectly straight trajectory. The weapon thundered into the dry old tree, which cracked into pieces. At the sight of such phenomenal power, the entire group erupted in cheers while Jail remained silent. All that remained of the tree was a trunk with many thorns sticking out of the top, which could cause a lot of birds if touched. Picking up his spear's Rat Crack walked back to the tribe with a nonchalant expression as if nothing had happened. They ran to meet him, shouting joyfully and asking how he managed to hide such abilities. Even if that tree was dead, it was amazing how it was destroyed in one blow. Until recently, everyone had been dying. It was Rat Crack who had saved them from such a life. Not far from the pandemonium, a herd ran by, causing the ground to shake. Everyone felt this vibration. Coming to the edge of the oasis, he beckoned everyone to look at the miracle. This herd of buffalo was running, raising a pile of dust behind them. It was not large, so hunting would not be a problem. It was an incredible coincidence. In time, the herd seemed to be slowly approaching, having smelled the scent of water on the hill. However, considering that they had never seen a herd of buffalo approach this hill, there was no doubt that the buffalo had gotten lost as well. It was strange that a buffalo herd that always traveled around the same place was lost. There was no point in waiting any further and traveling all that way later. This could not have happened without God's providence. Grabbing his spear, the boy jumped forward without thinking, ignoring any attempts to stop him. Today, they would not be dependent on hunger. Throwing the weapon that some time ago destroyed the tree, he hid directly into the forehead of the animal, killing it instantly, lying breathless on the ground. The terrified herd roared, jumping over the body, saving their lives. The joyous tribe of lizardmen caught up with the leader and raced to the buffalo's body. The Almighty had sent them, not only bugs but meat as well. The boy's mind raced. Taking the body back to the village, they lit a fire and sat down together to prepare for dinner. A pillar of smoke rose above the mountain, making it clear that something was going on there. In the center of the settlement, on a mountain of bones, 100 skulls of ungulates with red liquid dripping from the bull's head. It was an altar of sacrifice. Rak Rak, as a priest sent by the god, sat on his knees addressing the god with respect to them. It was the only act of showing respect to Tenks, a being higher than themselves. And it was enough. He asked to accept their offering, no matter how small it was. The entire group around him voluntarily bowed their heads, repeating the chief's request. Although it was an unusual and sloppy ritual in execution, it didn't matter to someone. What mattered was sincerity. Thanks to it, he was able to gain so much faith that it exceeded all expectations. It was a worthy ritual for Rak Rak as an aspiring priest. When the protagonist thought about the time he had put into it, it no longer seemed wasted. It was worth it. Someone believed in buffalo, not in the god of some wild grass that was their food. To provide enough meat, he had to get them to leave their stable. He couldn't create a grass that didn't exist, but he could destroy one that already was. Now, this was where the help of other insects, locusts, came in handy. They narrowed the circle of direction, leading them to their desired goal. For the smaller half of the evening, they managed to eat. At this stage, it was hard to expect knowledge and skills equivalent to herding, though that would be too much to expect. They knew how to dig up the roots of plants, but didn't know that it was better to leave some and bury good seeds in a pile to crossbreed them. The plotline of so many wars, the maximum limit would only be reached in a few years. Since they know nothing of farming and animal husbandry, this time will be hard to survive. Knowledge and skills play an important role. It is very iconic to realize certain knowledge on your own. You can't say it outright because it violates the law of causality. Not that there is no way, but it takes some time. In the first place, it would be wise to start with a blessing. Each time the group hunted buffalo, more and more. Each evening, new animal parts were added to the altar, and for the present, our energetic appearance under several meters in height. This morning was no different from the others, except that JL, who was walking in the center of the settlement, noticed Rack anxiously examining the altar. It had been a long time since the first altar had been created. Not only had it changed, but so had the lizard men. There was nothing left of their blue scales, all of them replaced by the black scales blessed by the bug god. Last night, he had a disturbing dream that kept him awake. Was it a dream or even an oracle? Not even the chieftain knew it was ambivalent. Looking at the altar, the tapping of bones could be heard. It was shaking unbelievably in the pond of blessings that have protected the tribe for many years. Not even a small fish came anymore. The ground was so dry that not a single plant root could be found. Both knew that they had not gotten to that point yet. This dream was about the future. In the girl's opinion, there was nothing to worry about because the god was taking care of them. Rakrasi had always listened to the ex-chief, but this time he still went to the top of the bones. He too believed in God. However, everything is God's will. Believers always seem to find it difficult. If one did not understand its meaning, the priests would convey the will of God. The chief was only afraid of one thing: sitting on the altar. It was hard for him to even remember the first shabby altar they had made years ago. Only the landscape had not changed over the years. But today, gazing into the horizon, the chief saw something he did not wish for anyone. The situation was not favorable, and he asked Jael to come to him and express his opinion. The girl listened to him and started to rise. Rack took her hand when they were at eye level. Squinting slightly, she saw the cloud of dust that was approaching the oasis. That explained why the altar was shaking so much. The group of lizards that had driven them away was approaching on a huge yellow creature. What looked like an overgrown gecko set the large head of the group. It was an appearance that was familiar to the entire settlement. Boy wasn't easy to forget, for he hadn't changed much since Rack had been banished from the tribe. He was over 2 meters tall and large enough that the other lizard men looked like children in comparison. But his great stature was not his only strength. It was expected the blue scales that the entire Rack village used to have before this big guy. And above all, what wasn't normal: someone had managed to write such a monster. Looking at the number of people arriving, it seemed like the entire tribe had arrived, which meant only one thing. Their hometown swamp, Greenskin Swamp, was completely devastated and destroyed. The vermin and must have devoured all the swampy areas. However, no one knew this. But did the desert guests know about the sanctuary? This oasis was surrounded by high mountains and was located so that you couldn't see anything until you went up to the top. There was a chance they might pass by without knowing the area. Jael suggested to the chief, but their whispers were interrupted by a yell from a neighboring mountain. Someone was addressing the visitors. The brave men from the settlement announced that this was the sanctuary. The hurry of a nameless beetle avatar and the green-skinned tribe could not make a move here. Poor Jael was ready to burn with shame. Today's patrol had been led by EUR, who was under her command, but the stupid lizards, instead of protecting the settlement, had only attracted unnecessary attention. Hatting the girl on the shoulder, Rack asked her not to worry. Perhaps it was the Lord's will. The boy said, as he headed down the cliff, picking up his spear, which lay nearby. He examined its integrity. The girl followed him down, assuming that the god had deliberately created this situation. Perhaps he intended to give them a test. However, the chief had other thoughts. It might not be a test, but a mission. He believed it was a mission to accept and save those who were originally with them. But even so, that guy was a powerful individual that possessed a giant beast. If he was a reasonable guy who understood something like this, he didn't continue to banish the weak tribe members into the wilderness. By such dialogue, the morpho butterfly flew in. It seemed like it was always there for him during difficult times. Is this really God's will too? It's hard to dare to think about it further. For now, the chieftain would do what he could. Rack understood exactly what Sun 1 meant. Rack's tribe and the Blue Skin tribe had to unite for population growth and technological development. Looking at how the tribe was moving, It seemed that the same fate had befallen them. The land had abandoned them for a reason. They were in need of rescue. Thus, there was a need for more people to learn about the glory of the nameless bug god. However, it was a bit strange for the protagonist that Rock made this decision on his own without listening to the wishes of the population. Perhaps it was due to the high willpower that the chief had a value of 14. It meant that individuals could take their own actions, and unexpected actions could lead to trouble for Sunwon. Did this guy from the blue-skin tribe, coming out of the swamps, really think it was my will god? Asked himself. In a way, he wasn't wrong. A leader with a high will performed his duties perfectly. If channeled, this power would be a more powerful and successful tool than simply controlling everything. If Xianwen could only instill a strong faith in the test group, progress would come sooner. Instead of letting the player control all the individuals, individually, our hero would be able to express his intentions more effectively, getting as close as possible to the mountain on which the armed guards stood. The brash leader asked that noisy little guys if they lived here. Apparently, he did not know that these lizard men with black scales had once belonged to one of the groups he had banished. The patrol clearly didn't like this. It seemed that, due to annoyance, they were ready to pounce right now. Someone so brazen had dared to insult them and take an interest in their land. The leader of the enemy tribe did not calm down and continued to pester them with questions about what they were doing in such a wasteland. The bushes, the trees, the loot, everything on this land belonged only to the Avatar Rack. Rack said, walking ahead of the help he had brought from the settlement, "What kind of avatar is this?" The stranger asked. "Looking down this place is the domain of an unnamed beetle avatar Rack." Rack, however, did not lose his confidence and replied that this was the domain of an unnamed bug avatar for such a person that stood at the hebdo. It unclear what was being explained to him. However, it didn't matter whether he understood or not. The arrogant lizard ordered the settlement to leave the place, threatening that if they did his will right now, he would not attack them. He didn't know how many of them were still hidden, but he was sure they wouldn't be able to defeat his group of beast men since ancient times. If there was a leader, he should use his brain and know how to calculate the outcome of a battle. Boar teased, contrary to such beliefs. Rack still didn't want to fight anyone. He wasn't stupid, just confident in his power. Given by the blessing, such an answer did not satisfy the leader of the enemy group. Most likely he originally wanted blood, putting the cope forward. The noble leader addressed the strangers, the poor people who had lost their homes, could now go to the abode of the God the Lord, could then take care of the new believers, as he saw fit. Such an answer made the enemy laugh. What a funny opponent he had. "You don't know how to calculate your moves," the stranger said, pulling the monster's reins on himself. He thought so, but he didn't know about the god and his abilities. He seemed to be talking nonsense. Blood boiling in both of them. Slamming the reins on the animal's back, the enemy leader ordered them all killed in the same spot. Manon's eyes glittered brightly, and he lunged at Rack, pointing his spear at his enemies. Rack stood confidently ahead of his pack, ready to sacrifice his life for them, kill them. Burr shouted, slapping the reins on Manon's back. It was an honor for the responsible chieftain to stand before his enemy, speaking face to face. He only asked himself for courage and strength in this fight. The huge reptile broke Rack's spear with one paw striking with its strength. For an enemy chieftain to be so irresponsible was foolish. The palace. Man's paw was so huge that when he wanted to crush Rack, a shadow fell over his entire body, blocking the view of the sun. There was a clash of civilizations. Two different tribes came into contact. Experience points for both tribes increased greatly. It was a difficult challenge, but it had its benefits. Sunwon had been paying too much attention to one tribe. These tribes were now his first-level area of Lizardman. Even new skills became available that could be used. And of course, the protagonist chose them. Meanwhile, the battle continued. A quick strike swept across the meat where the boy stood, causing Boer to smile satisfactorily. However, when the beast grazed a paw, beneath it stood the unharmed head of the tribe, which bounced aside in a moment. Something was wrong with him. Now Sunwin was controlling him. The boy looked down at his body, black scales, sharp claws longer than the joints of a foot, and an equally long muzzle came into his field of vision. Buka had no idea how he had escaped death, but he threatened not to miss a second time. So he commanded the mantle to kill him, to his own tribe. He was no longer the same Rak. His mind was ruled by his own god that looked so contemptuously at his enemy opening the status window. He surveyed the state of affairs. Busha was a member of the blue-skinned lizard tribe and had the starting stats level 1 tribe warrior level 2, tribe leader. Had strength, 24 intelligence, 15 sociality, 16. The special skill was breeding even one Rak. Rak was enough to handle this guy. The only problem was to subdue his strong little monster, Drake. At the moment, the biggest threat was just him, a level 1 man, and Drake with strength 87, intelligence 6, and sociality 9. At the same time, Rak was the leader of the tribe of the same name, a level 2 warrior and leader, a level 1 priest with strength, 30 intelligence, 24 socialization, 26 in will, 14. The abnormal status is the origin of a third-level saint with such parameters. Winning was not a difficult achievement. Rushing from his seat, he was at the very nose of the man in a few seconds applying the strong avatar skill. Sun One was confident of victory. This ability gives the user an additional characteristic called Divinity Class D. 1D is 100 times the maximum amount of energy that can only exist in nature. Simply put, Rak now has a power of 630 units. If the opponent did not possess the same amount of divinity, then fighting God would become impossible with one hand alone. He grabbed the jaw of the beast and flipped it in midair, toppling it over onto its own master. It was a huge difference in strength. Anyone lucky enough to witness the scene would be shocked. The impact seemed to shake the very core of the planet, and some blue-skinned lizard men fell to the ground with such force Sunwind could turn Manon into a bloody mess, but that would be too much. The guests would be more likely to be frightened than enthralled. Even the tribesmen that had seen him smash the tree with a single blow were impressed. The mantle was no longer able to fight and pressed his owner with his weight Rak. Surprised every time, even Jael recognized that. But watching the battle, she blocked the way for the impressed brethren that wanted to approach the lab. Boer was still alive to him. This situation was ridiculous to the point of absurdity. He didn't understand how he had managed it, and was sure he had pulled some kind of trick. When the beast was turned over, the knife that had so fortunately fallen near him fell from his belt, shaking off the weight that was weighing on him. He grabbed the weapon and ran awkwardly toward Rak, shouting that no one should dare to relax early. His calculations were never wrong. Not this time, however. One movement of his hand, and Boer stopped with his face red from the slap. His neck snapped back, and soon his knees went under. Silence reigned in the ranks of the blue-skinned group members. This was an absolute power. There were definitely those among the lizards who believed that there was no way for them to escape. Now, who is next? Asked the victor, looking at the frightened tribe, all of them unanimously through and on dry ground, not wanting the same fate. Kneeling the East battered and swore allegiance to the new leader. It was over now, but Rak could not believe it. He looked down at his hands for a few moments. The avatar had just passed through his body, leaving a wild feeling that he had dreamed it a satisfied son when sat on his throne, watching the lives of his test subjects the tribe had taken in all who wished to be enlightened into their faith. Everyone was fed and warmed. No one even mentioned the recent skirmish. One of the beginners wondered if they were the members of the tribe who had gone into the wilderness. It was a natural question since the color of their scales was so different from the original. Following the bug's nameless avatar, they had not only changed in appearance, but had also become much stronger. Such a statement surprised them, and it made sense. Otherwise, they would have died wandering the desert. The avatar was a salvation on them. His avatar power was surprising. Not far from the Krupa sat two men Jael. Indignantly asked the guy, was the guy so stupid that he didn't even know what had happened this day? But was there a lizard man with such power in this world? Rak had never even imagined such a thing. The girl was worried about the boy. Would everything be all right? But the chieftain didn't understand the questions. She was worried over the addition of about 6 times their settlement. The oasis would dry up with such topics this place, it was deteriorating fast. Soon they would have to leave. No one would want to go back to the desert from this beautiful place. They can't just wander the wasteland without answers. The answer must definitely lie there. Rock turned his head to the side. He couldn't seem to give a clear answer, but he did have one thought. God would not abandon them, and at any rate, had given the answer through his old brothers. He seemed to want the tribe to reunite with their old acquaintances. They had been isolated for a long time, and they had larger numbers. Perhaps there would be someone among them who would come up with a wise idea. The morning began quickly in the quiet settlement. Manon, who was the first to wake up, was tied to a tree with vines. He was not happy with this arrangement. Whenever people with spears approached him, he waved his paws violently to the sides. They tried to tell him that his master had disappeared. There was no need to continue the battle. It was better to just surrender. But he didn't listen to them, each time trying to throw the guests away from him. Once, he even succeeded. When someone approached too quickly, the beast waved its tail, throwing the tog on his back, hadn't expected this, and swore loudly, getting up off his back. This method of taming wasn't working. The Manon's eyes glittered as his prey came closer and pounced on it. However, if it continued to flounder like this, it would definitely either tear the vines or topple the tree and run away. Yer yelled at the animal, asking if he really wanted to be scolded for this. However, the hand of the unknown man stopped at yelling. Rack came to visit the Manon, who was shaking at the sight of him, remembering how this guy had disarmed him in one move. As the guy approached, the animal backed away until it was against a tree. The chief stuck his hand out in front of it and ordered it to eat. It didn't look appetizing, but after sniffing it, he decided to try a bite. The settlement was clearly surprised at the capabilities of State, who was handed, "Wait, please wait. Hear me out. If you enjoy this video, how about you subscribe, like, and hit that notification button so that you will be able to be notified when I upload another video." It didn't look appetizing, but after sniffing it, he decided to try a bite. The settlement was clearly surprised at the capabilities of their head, who was hand-feeding the brutal beast. He became more affectionate and asked for more food, which they did not refuse to give him. It must make sense that a god would keep him alive. He had little food that was given in large quantities. But if he wants to stay with the tribe in the future, one must be patient. It's cute when the intelligent beast settles down, looking with big eyes at his new master. If the Manon causes trouble again, let me know. Ordered the chief leaving to jail, who was sitting near a large log. She handed the chief the weapon with which Boar was going to attack him, turning it in his hands. He marveled at the skill that made it possible to do such a thing. If it weren't for that boy's persistence, I would have made better blades. Said the lizard awarded with a huge number of scars. He's a blade artisan. But why did he say that? Asked the head of the settlement. It was simple. Because of the trees in the making process, they use a lot of wood. But is the weapon made by lighting a fire? Suggested Rack, looking at the blade. But no, to make a special fuel, you have to burn wood. Most likely, Boar had forbidden them to burn trees. He felt that preserving the environment was better for the tribe than harder metal. And since they had to leave in a hurry, they didn't have enough time to test that. After a bit, the guy said he'd think about it and report back a decision on it tomorrow. It wasn't an urgent matter, so there was no rush for now. The scarred lizard left for the settlement, but he was replaced by an older man with no left arm. He came to them as they were looking for a guide. He was an avid traveler, as befits an old lizard man. He had scales of a different color than the blue-skinned tribe, and certainly different from the Rack clan, whose scales were black. This man wouldn't be a completely different species, so patches of his green skin still had blue coloring, but he definitely belonged to a different group. The wanderer, with his old body, wandered around looking for a place where he would be accepted during this long and fascinating time. A lot of things happened, and the most important thing was that he managed to learn to see the way. However, How was that possible in a place where he had never been to find his way home? He had plenty of places in mind that wouldn't let him starve, but he couldn't guarantee it would be the same other wanderers and tribes. Does that mean they are not far away? Asked the chief of the guide, who nodded affirmatively. If they are, then everything is fine. In case they are against the Rak tribe, all you have to do is defeat them and take them away. Indeed, if you have that kind of will, you can pull it off. But what about the traveler? How can he prove his faith? The question was a strange one, but the elderly lizard pointed to the sky. His answer was there. It wasn't just any sky. He asked to meet at night to explain everything. Then the night sky glittered, decorated with many stars. Looking up, the chief realized it was about them. The stars moved to point the same way every night, although they changed their position in the sky, but it did not prevent the wanderer to think of ways to use them. If you know which paths the stars follow, you can move along the path of a person and not get confused. The old man was willing to tell Rak about the movement of the stars if you would lead a few days with him and then not question his loyalty. They spent half the night together discussing the rules of using the night sky. It was amazing, new knowledge. There was more than enough information for one night. So they agreed again. Eeyore, who had joined them not long ago, was scratching his head at the end, trying to say something. The chief asked what had brought him here, if Manel had caused a problem, but you said he just looked a little disgruntled. Ever since they started giving him his food on time, he had become more affectionate, which couldn't have been a good thing. Jail had scared them, though she said that everyone needed a way to get around without starving to death. That was exactly what happened. Watching Rak tame a mantle with good taste in food, you're suddenly thought of something if it could be tamed with something completely different, like the water buffalo meat that often appeared near the settlement. This is how the Rak's tribe began to understand the essence of the skill of animal domestication. It is said that at some point in human history, mankind was divided into two parts, one to farming and the other to herding livestock. Although the source of this information is games, farming would then be a stable option for civilization, creating an environment that could block outside attacks, and stockpiling food allowed the population to grow steadily. In fact, large civilizations also started with large rivers. Reason Sun 1. However, the tribe he chose was the Lizardmen. Their strong physical fitness and high level of adaptation to the environment gave them the ability to bring living beasts into the settlement without any problems. What they need more than anything else is herding rather than farming. Juror and the other warriors caught and brought in a herd of water buffalo. Most of the warriors were exhausted, even with the insect blessing, but the herd of water buffalo even refused to resist and stood in formation. They had already made wooden fences to temporarily contain the buffalo herd, and when they locked them in there, they placed a sentry to prevent the buffalo from being secretly slaughtered. A commotion arose among the lizard men over the fact that of all the herd of tasty buffalo, but they could not eat any of them. Jail even appealed to the chief on behalf of the lizard men as to why such a ban was in place. But the fellow answered nothing and only said that, all in good time, in addition to farming, to Sunwin's surprise, there was also a technology that would ensure everyone's success. Ironwork was one of the crafts that interested Sunwin in the afternoon. Rak helped the iron craftsmen build a fire. They built a brazier and put a lot of wood on it. Then they covered the outside with mud to keep the fire from going out when the fire was lit. The holes left for air to help the fire burn were plugged, and they waited for the wood to burn down completely. The chief could not understand why things were done this way, but decided to just trust the iron craftsman when it came to God's will. He knew he was right, but he recognized his ignorance in other matters. But the iron craftsman's skills didn't end there. He took 2 split wooden planks and placed them in front of the fire pit, stacking them together. The artisan then tied a wooden stick to the center of the structure and pressed it down with the palm of his hand, allowing the wind to flow easily through the fire hole. Taking the heated blades out of the mold, the blacksmith began to hammer the blanks into shape, leaving them to cool in the wind. They would finally be able to produce basic iron items for now. They could cost less than well-worked bronze for the Rak tribe, who had no choice but to use stone weapons. This would be quite useful. Having a traveling old man in the tribe was also an unexpected gain. Astronomy would be a revolutionary discovery. Of course, it was still too primitive to be called such a famous science. However, it could become much more in the distant future. Astronomers could later help with architecture or math when hoped that Rak could make proper use of the stargazer. When night fell, the ringleader met up with the traveler again. The night sky had changed, just as the starcatcher had said it would. However, Rak thought that one night could have been just a coincidence, and the starcatcher agreed. Then the starcatcher told him how the stars would move again, and the boy memorized it carefully. It was just as the starcatcher said. The stars played the role of a guide across the sky. Now, the head of the tribe had no choice but to do what he had already planned. One evening, Jane, at the leader's command, threw more wood on the fire and gathered the whole village around the altar. "It has been a long time since the god brought them to this land," said the chief, addressing the tribe. During this period, they had even met their brothers. They could have been killed, but they chose to live independently. All of them could live on this land in peace and harmony for a long time, not letting outsiders in. However, those who were kicked out could have died in the desert, but that would not have been right. God desired salvation, not judgment, because it would benefit a large number of people. At dawn, they will leave the oasis Rak said, and invited the stargazer to join him. All the clan members began to talk quietly among themselves. As the curious one-armed guide with turquoise skin approached the head, the man had been telling him about the movements of the stars for days. Digging into the words, the head of the settlement confirmed that everything the man had said was pure truth. The star will be their guide. From now on, everyone will trust the stargazer to show them the way, so that everyone will know. Then explain to everyone where you will lead us, the guide asked respectfully. After dawn, when the morning sun rises, illuminating the altar, they will head to the right side of it. The chief is going to keep going forward for 10 days, then 15 more to the right again, across the rotten lake, and 3 days on empty mountain trails with valley roads. After this walk, the end of their long agony awaits them in endless forest. There are many beasts there that will provide many years of hearty food. This area is also surrounded by packs of other races. Such an area was a great place to live. The lizard men listened to Rak's speech in complete silence. His statement had meaning for the entire tribe. He declared that the purpose of life was not just to survive, but to live in the name of the great god. The leader let the old man go, to which he took his place in the crowd. The boy next beckoned her over to him. He stood the very first in the row of assembled warriors and raised his head sharply when he was suddenly called out. The chief asked one question, why he had not eaten a single buffalo caught yesterday, but the mute question read in his eyes that he himself did not understand what was happening. "What you're asked," the chief, looking at the one standing majestically on the huge bones of the altar. He didn't eat anything simply because he wasn't hungry all the time. "You're justified. The whole tribe tried to catch the water buffalo, but he wouldn't eat anything. Well, it's true that everyone worked hard, but you stood his ground and said he wasn't particularly hungry. If he was patient, now he could have some meat later when he was really hungry. That's what he was really thinking." Rak noted the tribesman's excellent work. "Of course, you're wanted to eat the buffalo now, but refrained leaving it for the future. If it continued like this, it would be a wonderful food saver. As long as he wasn't starving, he was willing to do it again and again. Since the lad had managed to hold on, he should be compensated." Rak beckoned the artisan over to him. The new spear, forged from metal, glinted against the fire, reflecting reflections in different directions. It was a planned event. After all, it was obvious that the best warriors should have the best equipment. However, it seemed to the other lizard men, warriors, as well as Sun One, that there was something big about what was happening. Jura accepted the weapons from the blacksmith's hands and not believing his good fortune. In addition, those who followed Juras' words, those who resisted their own desires to eat what they wanted, should also be rewarded. Since they were patient in proving their dignity, they were also rewarded with quality weapons. Many of the tribe that didn't listen to the young man were already regretting their actions. It was amazing. Jael had been wondering since yesterday what the chief was up to. Perhaps what was happening now was what he had in mind in one go, that one had lifted the spirits of the entire settlement's son when, like the girl, thought that the unexpected event had already come to an end. But it wasn't now. Come forward one by one, the chief said, holding the water buffalo skull in his hands, to all true warriors. May God's protection be with you, he exclaimed, and put the bone on himself. Their onward journey would only be successful with the spirit of patience and expectation that they displayed to the head of the tribe as you approached Rock. Rock took the skull of the water buffalo, which was at the very top of the altar, and placed it on the young man's head. He is now a noble bone warrior. This is the will of the god. At these words, here seemed to choke up. Tears came to his eyes. This was how about 24 bone warriors were born. They believed that they had received a much greater reward than just being able to satisfy their hunger. And this was indeed the bone warrior army's son. One had seen something like this before in the perished world game, but such events were not foreseen. Now they must leave this holy place. The Lizardmen tribe cheerfully welcomed the warmth of the morning dawn. The bone warriors weren't the only ones evolving. Bright rays of sunlight illuminated the huge altar they would soon have to leave. It was the god's will, so they were no longer bound to this place. Let everyone create an image of the nameless bug god in their head, the chief ordered his clan. He couldn't say it would be easy, but he hoped to move forward without fear, just as they had shown patience in wanting to eat the buffalo. So they should be patient moving forward. It will only do them good. Go forward, expect, and move forward. The unnamed bug god will always guide them, ignoring the cheers. Rawcrack stood on the remains of the bone altar and looked up at the sky's sun when thought he was simply identifying the constellations disappearing in the dawn's rays. But that turned out not to be the case. He was muttering something. The chief lied that it was God's will, so he apologized to the Lord. Of course, Sun One had nothing to be upset about. Perhaps the players who wanted to move and control all of their characters would not be very happy. But after all, it was God himself who had chosen Rak, who had a high willpower to be the high priest. Thus, these results could only be welcomed. Most likely, even achieving the growth of the new organization went even better. You had grown in stats. Now his reliability was 7, and the Warriors 3, even Rak's special abilities saw the light of day. His leadership rose to 14, priest to level 2, and warrior to level 9. The job was excellently done and in no way disappointed the expectations of the god. From this point on, the chieftain would be given a full start. The afternoon, sun was heating the desert to the point of glowing lava. It was difficult to move. At this hour, the entire tribe had left their oasis and had been traveling for some time. Rak was disturbed by a herd of buffalo. The warriors dragging them forward and the buffaloes being dragged behind them were tired, though the animals were now obediently following the clan. They were also exhausted. They simply did not have the strength to run away. Even Manel, who had great strength, was irritated by the sun and the accumulated fatigue. He refused to continue the paths and lay down where he had stood a second ago. All the while, he was being addressed affectionately. It used to be that if it happened in the Blue Skin clan, he would be forcibly lifted up with spears. But with Rak, he had the opportunity to indulge even when he could not. He must be tired, the stargazer suggested, as he approached the chieftain. Rak asked the guide if there was time to get some rest. However, given everyone's fatigue, there was nothing more to be done. He gave permission to take a break. Break, shouted the chief to the whole tribe. Even though it would be a short break, everyone was glad for it. It was unimaginably difficult to walk in this blazing sun. Within the group of lizardmen, loud conversations began to be heard. If they followed this mountain path that was visible in the near distance, they would reach the place that the head had spoken of. Someone was asking himself if he would gain strength if he rested. No one knew what would happen, so they assumed that they should take advantage of the opportunity. Almost no one had eaten anything. 3 days had already passed. They seemed like an eternity. It was still lighter than it had been when they were thrown out 3 days, and the whole group is already very tired and running out of food. They can't just hope for another God-created miracle to happen. Rack was saying to the stargazer. The earnest conversation was interrupted by the clamor of the clan members clustered on the hillside. And then one of the warriors ran up to Rack. "The herd has appeared ahead of us," he said, with a worried expression. "They're fearless bastards." The joyous orcs didn't number a dozen in their summers in the team, but with smiles on their faces, they approached Rack, shouting, "Excellent." Nothing connected them to this place in the desert. Now they, with only a few clubs, were running away from the horrible place with their heels blazing. What else could there be in the canyon more horrible than the beast that reigned there? The Shackles' escape was interrupted by a tribe, lizardmen who were taking a break after a hard journey. Naturally, they did not expect to meet anyone on their way. Raising his spear on his shoulder, Rack grinned and told the guests that they were indeed scaleless. Should they be called a fire moth that flies voluntarily to its death? The orcs lost the power of speech, and the tribe of lizardmen from such madness only made a hand-face expression. The tribe was armed to the teeth with armored heads. The guests, on the other hand, had primitive clubs in their hands, which they immediately swung to the ground. The orcs bowed in fear to their strong opponents, constantly apologizing there had been a misunderstanding. They explained they just wanted to get out of this canyon quickly. The lizards listened calmly to their story and graciously offered them a supply of sweet root vegetables. The orcs were in a hurry. They left home and ran away, thinking of the tribe members who had gone into the wilderness. They only wanted to find something to eat. But why were they in such a hurry to put up their fort so quickly? They feared standing up slightly. One of the orcs pointed to the hill they were running away from, Rack. Looked around the hillside. It was deserted, but there didn't seem to be any problems. According to the guide's words, the canyon they were now in was supposed to be traversed in 3 days. And since they had survived everything so far, they could probably survive for a few more days. In addition, as the environment changed, edible plants began to appear here and there. They lived there. Though not rich, they could still make a living until a terrible monster appeared. Orcs themselves were large in size, so what could have frightened them? It was not only Rack who was interested in this question, but Cyanwan as well. What kind of monster was this land that even that god didn't think of it? A huge concrete fortress, and many of the same oblong parts covered the body of the Scolopendra. This abomination is deadly, even alone. The ancient cancer had some characteristics: an abomination of level 9, strength, 120 intelligence, 12, and sociality 4. The plot of the Perished World game was that the old avatars had left the planet. However, only the gods had disappeared, and the numerous species and creatures that served them remained. Among them was the abomination. Simply put, it was like a giant boss monster that would appear in the field, and whoever took the risk and hunted it would be rewarded accordingly. Rack assigned a small group of warriors to guard the rest of the clan and told them to get a good night's rest, while he asked the orcs to point out the place where they had fled in such a hurry. It turned out that there was a monster sleeping there, which amazed not only the chief, but also Jael and the traveler who had followed him. This abomination was sleeping in a ball at the bottom of the canyon. Around it lay the remains of living creatures, which only a glance at which one could realize the nightmarish size of the scalloped. One head alone was the size of 4 large water bowls. Such creatures still had special abilities as well, venomous crustacean fangs with the blessings of forgotten avatars. Even if the lizardmen teamed up with the orcs, this enemy would still be invincible to them, Sunwin reasoned as he watched the test subjects. Rack watched the creatures. Crumpled movements. However, as time went on, they intensified. The Scolopendra began to move vigorously, as if searching for prey. The ground shook, putting the tribe into panic, but it was just movement and sleep-talking. said the orc who had survived with it for days in the neighborhood. Should they just run away, and how long would it even take to get around such a thing? Asked the head of the settlement in the Stargazer, the old man thought for a moment and replied that if they went back into the desert again, following the mountain range, it would most likely take 8 days. Rack hesitated. He didn't know what to do. Looking at his tribe, he realized they were all afraid. Taking a detour was also a great solution, but it also had its nuances. Looking down from above Sun, when patiently watched the lizard, wanting to hear his opinion, the tribe was extremely fortunate. Not only did they have a wise chief Rack, but also an equally intelligent jail. The girl scrutinized the condition of the many-legged creature, which seemed to have no flaws. It was so well positioned that if a victim fell into it, he would never get out. However, this place had its faults. At the top of the canyon were huge piles of rocks that had once rolled down from a larger mountain. Jail was not stupid. Quickly turned to the tribal chief. She was ready to fight. The girl had excellent stats, a level 3 warrior and a level 1 mediator with strength, 26 intelligence, 35 social skills, 28 and intuition. 11. Now they had an advantage that no one had realized until now. Even the orcs who had been in this area for days didn't know about it. The Iron Master used the fastest method of raising the temperature of the metal. Would the chieftain remember that Jail asked? Rack answered that he used a special tool, and he was right. This tool had its own name, bellows. In essence, they had the principle of a blacksmith's bellows. Thanks to this tool, more air and less force is required than before. Perhaps if they used this tool, they could produce enormous power with little effort. But where was Jail going with this? The boy asked. This device was created after the blacksmith had given it a lot of thought to make it teth. Now would take quite a bit of time. However, they don't need such complicated tools. In this case, replied the girl, simple tools would be more than enough. The stones would bury the Scalapendra in its own sleeping place. The hillside was high and uneven. At the foot of the slope where the ancient Scalapendra wriggled and slept, there was a steep slope at an angle that almost came to a perfect straight line. If Rack and his warriors fought him there, they would not be able to move easily because of the steep slope and would most likely come into direct contact with the ancient crustacean. On the other hand, the giant creature had very many legs, so it would be able to climb up the even steeper slope. According to the plan, the chieftain was only supposed to approach the abomination when they were about to kill it. There were warriors standing near the boulders that Jail pointed out they were not with bare hands. They had found and uprooted several tall trees in the area, and each held one. The warriors shoved the logs under the boulders on the mountainside and then tilted them hard upward, but the boulders did not immediately budge. The rock at the edge of the mountain wobbled from side to side, chipping away pieces of rock little by little. With its enormous weight, Jail, who was also trying with everyone, ordered them not to give up and to work together. The girls' knowledge could be attributed to physics, the concepts of which they had not even heard of. Every time they finished a report, the whole tribe piled on a log together. Though the lizards had never encountered such a principle as leverage, they had managed to figure it out each time the stones swayed more and more. But for now, it stayed in place, watching the Scalapendra quietly unaware of what was happening overhead Sun, when rather waited for the next steps, rolling out rocks to kill the enemy. This one was a simple and wonderful idea. However, in order to catch crustaceans of this level, one would need to roll all the stones at once. But was that possible? In reality, Jail commanded to use all her strength and roll all the stones even faster. It worked. The stones surged forward, rolling forward at a tremendous speed. Such a rumble woke the ancient Scalapendra, causing it to raise its head. If the beast had been smart, it would have avoided the pile of rocks. However, the ancient Scalapendra saw the boulders rolling towards him as a challenge rather than a danger. He lunged at the first boulder, and it rolled down with great speed, then struck, hitting it precisely on its armored head. They did it. The lizard men's settlement screamed, except they couldn't kill it. The ravaged centipede howled loudly as it straightened up to the enemy. One stone was no match for her. It only did a little damage to its head shell. With a multitude of legs, she scrambled up the steep slope to kill her attacker. It had to hurry and throw the rest of the rocks off the cliff at the frantic creature as quickly as possible. However, it was too late, son. One got up from his seat and descended to the ground. The guy descended into Rak's body to control the situation. It was too early to lose in this game. Everyone's eyes rounded when the leader pushed everyone away and pressed his full weight on the lever. The stone flew upward with all its might. 3 warriors couldn't do it at once, but he managed without listening to Jail's commands. The chief, even without using the lever, pushed the boulder beyond his own height. Every muscle in Rak's body tensed so that the veins were visible. It seemed impossible at first, but with the power of a god, it was nothing. All he had to do was keep up with him and throw the stones together. Skalopendra continued to shriek, all the while deafeningly shrieking. Before anyone knew it, the chief was rushing forward with his spear for the boulders. He threw it at the evil creature with lightning speed, hitting the concrete structure that protected its back in terms of size. It wasn't that big of a wound, but it was enough to hold him back for a moment. A cry of pain reminded the canyon when the spear pierced his vulnerable spot. However, it intensified. A few seconds later, when huge rocks piled on top, as well its whiskers, jaws and paws were broken off from the heavy blows. Thick green liquid splashed from the damaged areas, staining the sand. The last boulder fell on its head, crushing it to dust, a spectacular sight. Ratcrack landed successfully on his leg, still engulfed in godly aura and sun. One returned to his throne, satisfied. The hunt was a success. The tribe had killed an abomination of ancient Skalopin, a Pendra. The whole tribe shouted their victory over the monster. Faith in God only grew. But in addition to that, something else important appeared as a reward to our hero. The game moved a new item that he wanted to get from the beginning. A red orb engulfed in flames floated in someone's hand. It was the essence of the abomination, its core. When it came to a god, its greatest power was its ability to create something. Just as Sun, one was able to create enough food to feed the tribe. Every god could create resources according to their realm, using the faith points. However, to create something that didn't exist in the world, one had to use equally rare resources. A creature created by a god could also evolve to a higher level, which would earn the title of an apostle or avatar. So could also be used as a useful strategic weapon in place of a god's will. They could even be used as generators of faith that spread the word of God through their existence. But is the creation method itself the same as in the original game Sun? One wondered, what would it be like to create Thought the god while twirling the sphere in his hands? The lizards looked at the dead body of the Scala. Pendra, with curiosity, Jail, ripped off one of the monster's paws and thought that if it was monster meat, then maybe it could be used for food, though it had a peculiar odor, but it was worth a try. Spitting out the raw meat, she said, although the flavor was not good, it could be eaten. It seemed to be hard to eat like this. The girl trimmed the fibers of the food, analyzing its appearance. It might be difficult to eat raw food. It might be worth it to use other ingredients. The lizards might have picked an edible, fragrant herb and cooked it over a fire as an attempt to mask or dispel strong, nasty odors. Opening the paw of an ancient crayfish Jail, left the meat there and sprinkled some floats to give the food a pleasant flavor. She offered the first taste to the chief, who was impressed the food was edible, but a little tasteless, which was logical because the girl was just learning to cook, as they had no such concept of cooking. Simply roasting meat was already an accomplishment. However, Jail went further. Not only did she cook on fire, but she also added seasonings. The smell from the raw meat was so nasty that Rack even thought of throwing it all away, but cooking solved everything. Now, the head of the settlement wanted to learn this skill as well. He didn't hesitate to take new food that he liked. The lizard girl, who was sitting next to him, said that she had seen that the leader of the orc tribe had already had a receiver, so she advised Rack to find a companion. Food fell from the poor lizard's hands as his jaw dropped to the ground at such a statement. But the girl continued to speak. The chieftain was getting old, so it was necessary to stabilize the tribe, to find a maid. Since becoming chieftain, there was no time to even think about it. Brave Jael offered himself in that role, unless, of course, he had someone else in mind. It was a very serious and responsible conversation. The boy was ready to somehow change the subject, but the sun that was setting did it for him. Its direct rays shone directly on the beautiful girl behind whose back reflected the light that interested everyone in the ruins of the concrete that once stood on the back of the Scala Pendra. Lay a golden slab on it were carved Egyptian hieroglyphics with a heading from a drawing of herding and farming. It seemed to be some kind of rules. It didn't take long for you to start gnawing on this soft material to this. The stargazer said that this kind of metal was called gold. Jael had seen such a thing once. A metal master had once shown her the different kinds of metal. If it is cleaned well, it will reflect light and shine beautifully. They say it doesn't change or rot, even after a long time. However, gold belongs to the soft metals and was no better than iron. Now, of course, the precious metal could be used as jewelry, but this type of art was unfamiliar to lizard men. Unlike other species, naive, you're asked, what was the point? Then, if it didn't rot, it was too soft and heavy for metal. You couldn't even eat it. At this statement, the kind old man sent the young lizard away with the excuse of catching a deer. That hoofed animal with branching horns had sweet and juicy meat. The orcs showed him the stag's tracks, so he gave him the tile with the remnants of teeth marks and left to hunt Rak. Preferred to stay behind to dismantle the tile, for the tribe had the freedom to come and go at will. They did not need his accompaniment. It was strange that this metal did not even rot. The chief brought one of the deer carcasses and placed it on a huge stone, which turned red in a few minutes. Everything in this world waxes and wanes. There was nothing that didn't change, but this golden tablet was different. Whoever created it was definitely trying to preserve important information. What could it be? Jael disturbed the chief's peace and reported that everything was ready for bed. The boy hadn't told anyone where he was going. It was amazing that the girl always found him, though that was even a good thing. The only lizard man that wore a fur coat was the chieftain. He was different. Rat Crack looked over his shoulders nonchalantly, saying that it was just as Jael had said to put it on. It was true. She wanted to give him as head of the tribe something different, that everyone who saw him would know he was the head of the tribe. A chief is like a symbol, the girl said, pointing out its value. After sending Jael to bed, the boy began to think about the plaque. All night, he stayed near the corpse of a deer over which flies buzzed. Life ends in death. Everything fades away in time. That was the only phrase that kept running through Rak's mind. He needed a clue, just the slightest clue, and there it was. The fireflies gathered together and drew symbols in the air with their light. The unusual behavior caught his attention. It seemed like an illusion or even a fantasy. The insect's movements resembled the marks on the golden plaque. Like an obsessive, he began to decipher the symbols by drawing all night with a branch on the ground. Lizard men were primitive creatures. They found it easier to use symbols than letters. For example, they used symbols such as weaving two tree trunks together to indicate direction, or stacking stones to mark their territories. In hunter-gatherer culture, in particular, knowledge of which directions animals move or which plants are edible developed over many generations. At dawn, the boy snuck over to Jael, peeking into her tent. The girl jumped at this unexpected visit, thinking there was a problem. However, nothing happened but Rak. Rak had something surprising to show her, bringing her to the very spot. The guy drew a triangle with sticks on the ground. It was the sign of the lizard men. Men Jael asked to show her everything he had been given to learn. Not far from one symbol, he drew another triangle, but this time it was upside down with sticks. It looked like a tequila glass. It meant a woman, but more specifically, a lizard man, woman. Drawing an equal sign between the meanings, the girl asked what it meant. With a smile on his face, the chief explained its meaning to become each other's companions. Getting as close to the girl as possible, he whispered that this was also his answer to what Jael had suggested earlier. Taking the stick from the guy's hands, the girl began to draw another meaning, asking if he knew the other signs as well. The answer followed in the affirmative. In the warm pink dawn, the two lizard men studied the writing with their tails intertwined, excellent in order to develop properly the Rak. Rak tribe should have gone through several generations. Reason, Son 1. However, it was good that it happened early in the game. For now, the Lizardmen tribe was enjoying their carefree time. Rak. Rak was hunting deer with the tribe in the forest. With only one spear and immense strength, he could easily catch his prey. The warriors who went with him praised their skillful leader. At first glance, it seemed a simple hunt, but capturing the biggest prey to present to your spouse was one of the traditions of the wedding ceremonies. It was a beautiful hunt, except for one thing. Instead of brute strength, Jael used her brain to its fullest, while Rak spent a lot of energy. The girl used traps to easily catch game, wiping her spouse's nose. Son 1 was content to watch from the sidelines. She had him beat back in the canyon to where only chitin remained after the crustacean's death. The orc spoke to Rakrach. He asked if the lizard men would be okay, but the chieftain replied that it was fine. In the end, the monster was the only obstacle they managed to encounter. This area in the desert was originally the dwelling place of the orc tribe, so they have the right to continue living there, as they deserve to. At such words of Rak, the man was ready to cry, but holding back and showing courage, he bowed in thanks to the lizard chief, calling his son to him. The orc offered to accept their help. They know this place better than anyone. How? So he was willing to send his child to lead the lizard men. They would never forget the help given by Rak tribe. The chieftain, his clan, hurriedly set off on their journey. Fortunately, Jael's cooking had made part of the ancient crayfish edible. The body and intestines, which were the largest part, were not edible, but the large legs lost their spiciness after being coated with spices and cooked over coals. It was still tasteless, but it was already better than before. After leading the tribe out of the desert, the last orc said goodbye to the lizards, who continued their journey along the green path. There was something unusual about this place. Even the tribe noticed a different feeling. Footprints with long toes were visible on the fresh grass. Turning to the stargazer, the leader asked if he had seen such things before, and if he knew to whom they belonged. The answer was positive. The marks were probably left by frogs that walk on two legs. The old man suggested frogmen. All creatures are divided into good and bad, and can also speak and think like the others. They were out scouting and must have had a lot of experience in warfare. The number of footprints indicated that it was clearly not just one individual. There must have been about 5, a more numerous tribe than Rak's group. It was time to head back to base, said the chief, who was worried about the safety of the tribe. Toward the end of the evening, dozens of tents had been created from huge leaves. Between them stood huge torches that illuminated their sleeping place. Passing by the tribesmen, the boy, together with Jael, looked around the camp. The tents were to be pitched as wide and as large as possible. That way, they had to fool the frogmans into thinking their clan was big when viewed from the outside. There are plenty of trees here, so making a fire wouldn't be a problem. At night, there would be a group of guards watching the fires, and if enough of them were made, they would think that the group of lizardmen was twice as big as it really was, even though the fires were useless. Oh, and at night, it wouldn't hurt to keep watch, assuming the warriors would be out scouting then. The other tribe would surely notice them, the girl said, looking into the distance, and she was not wrong. There were dozens of eyes watching them the whole time, after a few days. After the lizard men changed their base. Luckily, they didn't encounter any frogmen during this time. They had prepared many things to ensure the safety of the tribe. At this moment, there were hardly many players that were more successful than Son 1. Even he realized that the herding was going smoothly, and their way of life had evolved so quickly that it was no problem to adapt to the changed conditions. Even their homes had begun to be replaced by wood, forgetting the leaf tents. What was most interesting was how quickly they mastered the concept of writing Rak. Rak actively began to utilize the writing he had recently discovered. When the warriors returned from scouting, he always listened about what they had seen near the large and expansive rock in the center of the village. Taking the tip of a spear, the chief After each story drew on a large rock, the outline of the river, the village was marked in the center of the rock, and distances were plotted on a certain scale, reflecting the terrain. To be precise, it was a map created from hunting marks, but it incorporated the idea of creating a permanent record resembling writing. This record proved very useful. It helped the warriors organized into groups to navigate the terrain. While Rak was away, the chief also wrote down the amounts of crops each person had harvested in one day. They could look at who had harvested the most and could rest while some would compare and realize they had not brought enough and needed to work harder. This was effective in increasing productivity. Such rapid development could not have been more gratifying to Sun Quan. The swarms of locusts in the center of the continent were steadily increasing. Likewise, in the south, the insects were thriving in their nests. The insect territory had also reached the 4th level. This is a method the protagonist wouldn't dream of because of the other players. However, since it started from the distant lands in the east, isn't it worth trying to capitalize on this situation? Rak's capabilities and the tribe's status is currently above average. But this is only the beginning. What comes next will be bigger and more dangerous than anything experienced in the past. The leader of the settlement was chatting together with Jail, and suddenly the duty officer came running towards them, yelling loudly. They were in huge trouble. The frogmen were already halfway to their village. Rak certainly went to meet the one at the border. The head of the frogmen's tribe was with the brightest coloring, himself adorned with red feathers on his neck. These frogs did not come alone. They had a lizard man with them. The chieftain did not understand why the latter had allied himself with them. Had they come to make peace, the two tribes met in a small clearing in the forest. The warriors were still watching the frogmen and delivering information about them, so their first sight of the toads was not accompanied by surprise. Their skin was slippery, and they themselves were somewhat smaller than the lizard men. They were distinguished by their large eyes and transparent eyelids, short necks, and hard bodies. My name is Shunin. I am the son of the great chief of the Alloy tribe, the toad introduced himself. He was one of the largest men in his tribe, and he had a fancy rope around his neck, decorated with bird feathers. They had not come with intentions of fighting, so their motive was justified by curiosity. To Rak he was, in his own way, polite, so he too waved in response at his words. The chief also introduced himself as the head of his tribe and gave his name. He too had no intention of using weapons against the frogmen. However, why had those come to meet them? The lizard squinted his eyes. The toads looked at each other and nodded. They only came to meet them to inform the guests that they had trespassed into their territory, Rak's. Response to that was that he didn't know that. He didn't even think that absolutely all of that area belonged to them. When they came to that place, they didn't see any border markings. However, they would do their best to clear up the misunderstanding. He apologized for disturbing the frogman tribe. Seeing his calmness, the toads even quieted down for a while. However, the lizardmen had come from a very distant land and were very tired, so the chief asked permission to spend the night here, since he didn't have a home yet. This Shunin is the son of the great chief of the Alroy tribe. He seemed himself qualified to grant their request. Rak sucked up as best he could, not letting the young frog fall foul of his subordinates. It was truthfully possible, with his authority as the next leader of the tribe, watching the war toads that came with the chieftain's son, Rak, realized that they were sent to keep an eye on the lizard men, with questions piling up, particularly about their lizard friend. The chief needed to carefully gather all the information from the toads. This clearing was not the best place to negotiate, so the chief invited Shun to go to his village and continue in a more hospitable setting. Their tribes had come to a good agreement without any animosity, so a feast was in order. The lizard suggested. It didn't seem like the best idea to the toads, so they declined. They were grateful for the offer, but it was difficult to implement since there was no mutual trust between them. But Rak couldn't just let go of those who had done them a great favor in return for meeting them in the village. The lizards offered to eat in the same clearing. Though the toads had a bit of a debate amongst themselves, they still agreed. After making a fire and catching game, they put the deer carcass on a stick and hung it from the fire. In a short time, the odor of fragrant roasted meat formed around the clearing. The two tribes were having a friendly time in their small groups. One thing Rack needed to find out now was what kind of relationship that lizard man had with those frogs. But it would also be good to find out his purpose for staying with them. He couldn't ask directly. However, there was no way to show that he was interested in the subject. If his thoughts were revealed to another tribe, he would surely use it against them, keeping the conversation going. Rack asked the other chief what the jewelry around his neck was. It turned out those feathers belonged to cockatrice. The toad was fingering a piece of jewelry that was half the length of his arm as expected. The lizards had not heard of it. These were the dangerous animals that lived around this forest, huge birds that walked on two legs. Not only were they large in size, but they also had poisonous spurs. The frogmen had great difficulty catching them. In addition to their speed, they also had a wide range of motion. They were the reason why the Alroy continued to watch this area, and since they are hard to catch, they must be using another weapon that would be different from a spear rack, asked out of curiosity spears. Shunin questioned, squinting his eyes in an instant. The toad put out his hand and ordered the servants to bring his bow and arrows. He was determined to prove himself. The lizards were not yet aware of such a device, and he had no idea what he was about to see. However, no one responded, and then he summoned Owen to him, the lizard who lived with them. Since he had nothing to do, he ordered him to bring a bow and arrows, and the lizard man went to fulfill the request without any hesitation. As soon as he fulfilled the first order, the frogman asked him to perform another favor. By that, he meant to hang a piece of bark on the tree so that the heir to the head of the toads could practice archery. Without further ado, Owen went to fulfill the order. It looked like mockery from the outside. After pulling the bowstring tight enough, Owen released it. The arrow flew into the target with great speed. It was quite accurate considering the distance from which the attack had been launched. Frogmen learned to shoot as children. The toad descendant explained, ostensibly not bragging, but he hinted that he had always been one of the best archers in his tribe. That impressed the chieftain, but since Rack had already seen how it worked, he asked him to try his hand at using the hitherto unfamiliar thing called a bow. Shunan didn't mind, so he handed the weapon to the lizard. It proved to be a difficult endeavor the first time around, at first Rack couldn't even keep the arrow straight. It kept trying to move to the right side of the bow. Although the branch and string were definitely strong, the attempt was clearly clumsy. The strength of this weapon was weak compared to a spear, but with it, he could carry a few arrows in reserve. It was also much more accurate and had a faster attack speed. After pulling what seemed to be a fairly tight bowstring, he fired the first shot. Naturally, the arrow didn't even reach the target. However, Rack did not give up. He definitely wanted to learn this device, but no matter how many times he tried, he failed each time the arrows hit the ground. It's a very difficult thing to do. Nothing is easy. In the beginning, Shunning encouraged his new acquaintance, but at the same moment, he switched to Owen, who just stood there and ordered him to collect the arrows. The latter, just as obediently, ran to pick up the arrows. However, Rack told the toad that, since he was shooting, he should collect the arrows, but they waved him off and said it was just help. Still, there was something the lizard man wanted to know more than arrows. Walking over to Owen, the chief crouched beside him and began to raise his weapon. A light conversation ensued between the two. Rack nonchalantly asked his name so as not to frighten him, but he was still in a slight panic, which was strange. How did the lizard man end up among the frogmen? He asked the boy. He stammered with fear in his voice, twirling the arrows in his hand, swallowing some of the letters. He tried to answer his question. He's only with them because they live together with other races in the same village, lizardmen and frogmen. But is there really any reason for them to live together? The head of the lizardmen asked. It's because the two races can help each other. He answered with some confidence. It was hard for Rack Rack to imagine that the smile on Owen's face brightened. He seemed young and naive, so he suggested coexisting in harmony. Rack Rack was confused, for he had never imagined that such a thing was possible. If different species lived together, their different lifestyles would inevitably lead to conflict. Even if friendships were maintained, the division of society was normal. If the two tribes could help each other, what would that look like? The head of the lizards? Asked Owen, however, answered as if he had been rehearsing this for a long time. In exchange for receiving protection from the frogmen, they help in uncomfortable situations. The frogmen can't leave water bodies for long periods of time, but the lizards are able to do so, such as picking fruit and climbing trees. Sharing food with them was a good idea. The boy praised the chief, but the lizard men do well without them. So why protect them? Rack asked, looking at the arrows, because this forest is dangerous. The people of Alroy are the largest tribe in this forest. The young lizard man emphasized without them, Owen would not have survived. An awkward smile filled with sadness floated across his face. Rack squinted his eyes warily at his interlocutor and said, "Forget everything he said." Whoever asked what they were now talking about archery, the chieftain ordered back in their place. The lizards cut up the carcass into nice, juicy ribs. The son of the toad chief took a bite of the meat and was overjoyed. The deer meat was even more delicious when combined with the fragrant herbs, the head of the lizard. Men was glad that the food suited his taste, but had they ever eaten water buffalo? Rack asked, Shuning. Eyes glistened. He had caught one once, long ago, and it was delicious. The lizard, on the other hand, said he had a few more Parno hooves in store and was willing to trade it for a sack of arrows. Shunin was not sorry for a couple of arrows for such an exchange, but the guards behind him gave him a hard stare, and he still refused. The lizard leader continued to eat the meat and said with feigned disappointment that it was a pity. However, in any case, they would delve deeper into these discussions when their friendship improved. Fortunately, the Toad tribe members did not feel hostility towards the lizardmen. Indeed, they were not only friendly to Owen, but also to the rest of the lizardmen warriors. Since the two races lived together in their village, Shunin Beck and his lizardman friend over to him. The boy quickly left the company and found himself next to the chieftains. The one ordered him to explain to Rack how they had spent several months helping each other. The young man agreed. As long as it proved their friendship, he would continue to do so. As the lizardman leader had expected, they had prepared answers in advance, preparing for the meeting from day one. If he hadn't examined it carefully from the beginning, he himself would have believed their comedy embarrassed. The meeting was coming to an end. The Toads had enjoyed meeting their guests, but it was time to disperse Rack. Rack suggested that next time they should come to the Toads themselves. The hosts of the swamp had a long distance to cover, so he wanted to make things easier for them. But they said it was fine. The place was big enough, and they needed to check it out anyway. After saying goodbye to each other, the leader waved goodbye to his friends. The lizards followed suit and repeated the gesture when the Toads had their backs to the lizards. Shun put his arm sharply around Owen's shoulders and pulled him toward him. He seemed to be asking Jael and her husband for help. The gesture was clearly suspicious. It didn't look like a relationship of people on equal footing. Rack told his consort, by the time the Toads reached the settlement, the sun was already setting over the horizon, illuminating everything with yellow light. As soon as they reached the water, Shuning slapped the lizard with a loud slap. "Did you think we didn't know what you said to the leader of the lizardman tribe?" The Toad asked, pointing a finger at the wounded man. The boy slumped on a small sandy beach near a body of water and held his cheek in a trembling voice. Owen said he hadn't said anything. He had just been asked how to become a good archer. What a pathetic excuse, the Toad warrior asked and punched the lizard in the stomach, confirming his actions by saying that he couldn't even shoot properly and was already giving out advice, but he continued to argue that it was true. If he said he couldn't do it, it would look suspicious after a little thought. Shunin agreed with that statement. That's why he acted like he couldn't answer Rack, and also emphasized that if he wanted to learn, he needed to pay for the drills. Rack, as Owen had said, couldn't give her anything right away, so he stopped begging, looking among themselves. The toads found his words convincing and believed him, as expected from the skillful trickster. Owen said the toad leader's son to the boy, pointing his finger at the floating island, "Shun," and asked if he remembered who was on that piece of land. Looking in the distance, he saw only tents with guards, and replied that he remembered perfectly well. She was very lucky to be free. The toad boy said sarcastically he was gathering dozens of lizard men, children, from a guarded tent that was no different from a prison. Shunan was going to sacrifice them. However, they were saved by the fact that the new victims came to them themselves. Gritting his teeth, Owen tolerated such open blackmail. Looking at the unfortunate children, he lowered his head to the chief and said that they were incredibly lucky, therefore he would do his best to deceive them. Night came quickly. The sentries that had been near the children were replaced by others, and Owen continued to watch them. If he had only known this was going to happen, he would not have diligently broken into this settlement. They should have known when they welcomed them with open arms, despite their different races, or at least when they brought them to the Brotherhood ceremony and told them they could stay together on this land. The remaining 200 lizardmen can't stand up to a tribe of 1,500. Besides, they have a god, a huge green creature that put fear in everyone. She would never forget the sight of the two-headed monster that propped them up against the toad gate. That day, blood spilled and all in all directions, staining the ground and walls red. This monster ruled the Frogman settlement, just like the toads ruled Owen and the children. Wait, please wait. Hear me out. If you enjoy this video, how about you subscribe, like, and hit that notification button so that you will be able to be notified when I upload another video. Nothing was changing. The Rack tribe is unable to change the impossible. The leader of the Black Scale tribe looks like a strong warrior, but even so, they are savages who don't even know what a bow and arrow is. If only they were moved to sacrifice first, the children could survive for a while. Owen had no choice but to ask the children to live a little longer. He would definitely make lizards come to the frogs. The sun was illuminating the land with its warmth. The lizardmen brought the frogmen a water buffalo as a gift. Frogmans did not hide their delight and were very much overjoyed. Rock had said earlier that he would bring a live buffalo, and he kept his word to him. It seemed like a great trade for a bow, but Shuning was not convinced. Then Owen suggested that his chief do things a little differently in order for there to be a trade in it. Weapons. They could start getting to know each other through sincere conversations. It was a great idea. Besides, they didn't know anything about the Black Scale tribe yet and invited them to visit the frogs' village. Just then, they would be able to give them the bow. Doesn't this seem like a good opportunity to get to know each other? Rack Arrow fell to the ground after flying some distance. Jael asked him how he was doing this time, to which he replied that his arrows only flight half the distance that the frog shot. Looking at the bows they had managed to make by following example, he added that he didn't know what kind of creatures' tendons they used in their bows. Jael reminded Rack that their 5th meeting was coming up and that they were probably going to find out as much information about them as they could. Continuing to stare at the arrow stuck in the ground, he replied that it was obvious that they were up to something, but the biggest problem was that they didn't know when and what frogmen were going to do, so they had to be on high alert, which was exhausting, both mentally and physically. But in spite of all this, it was not in their plans to give up. So after saying that they had made some progress today, he asked Jael about the medicinal herbs that were supposed to be effective against the itching disease, to which he replied that the herbalist knew a place where there was enough of them. This was great news. But at the moment, Rack was most concerned about Owen, who he thought would be the key to their plan. Jael was clearly more determined than him, so the very next moment, she offered to give him a chance, which could be a great opportunity for them. At the same time, the delegation of frogmen, along with Owen, were on their way to their 5th meeting with Rack. Owen was in the tight embrace of one of the frogmen, making it hard for him to breathe, and he shouted desperately, saying that he had done everything they had asked and that it was not his fault that they had failed, to which Shunan, who was walking behind him, replied that it would take too long to lure the lizards. Owen replied that those lizards with black scales and water buffalo skulls on their heads were more cautious than he thought, to which Oboy, who was holding him, said with a sneer that it seemed those were different and were not as naive as his tribe, who had trusted them. Immediately, Owen had no choice but to smile and agree with his words, for it was the truth. The very next moment, Frogman threw him to the ground. Oh, Boy turned to Shunan and said he would go because he had some business left alone with Owen. Shunan told him that his father had ordered him to speed up the sacrifice ceremony, which took Owen by surprise. Shunan went on to say that he should hurry up and get as much information from them as possible and try to invite Rukrak and his warriors to their village as quickly as possible without arousing suspicion. When Owen heard this, he asked in bewilderment, what was the reason for the rush? Thinking to himself that he should listen carefully, since this information was being spread exclusively among the frogmen, he replied that his father's illness and that of the others was getting worse, and that he could not afford to delay it any longer. Owen was surprised at this answer and wondered if he was talking about the itching disease and if she wasn't just making everything itchy. Shunan replied in a slow and serious voice that originally the lizardmen were not supposed to know, but he could tell him. Then he began the story, explaining that the itching disease was much more frightening and insidious than it might seem at first glance. And if you got it, not only would your skin start to itch, but it would also start to have a sticky white slime on it that wouldn't go away, no matter how much you tried to wipe it off, and it would get bigger and bigger over time. If you were covered with it to a certain level, it became difficult to breathe, and then death would soon follow. That's how a priest in their tribe died yesterday. Owen was surprised to hear this, as he had not heard that the itching disease was fatal, but he realized that it was probably a test, so he could not show his true emotions. It also explained why some of the frogmen hadn't shown up lately, which could even mean that some of them might already be dead, but right now, it was important for him to play his part convincingly. So the very next moment, he said with sadness in his voice that this story should not reach the lizards. He added that if it did, they would laugh at them and also look down on them. Shunan replied that it was true, but they wouldn't be able to hide it forever. After a few seconds of thinking, Owen replied that even so, they had a way to keep the lizards under control, and to do so, they only needed to say that this disease could spread to the lizardmen as well. Hearing that, Shunan replied that it was a good idea, but the problem was that the disease couldn't actually spread to the lizards, to which Owen immediately replied that there were herbs that produced white slime and also caused itching, and if they used them, they could easily fool lizardmen. Their task was to pretend to be weak, and as soon as they took a bite to trap them. After hearing Owen's plan, Shunan was delighted. He patted Owen on the shoulder, praised him, and called him an excellent deceiver, to which he only smiled awkwardly in response. Shunan liked the plan so much that he even promised that if he succeeded in luring out the black-scale lizards, he would unconditionally exclude Owen's children from the sacrifice. When Owen heard this, he happily thanked Shunan and promised to do his best. However, Shunan thought that it would not be enough for the lizard man to do his best and told him that he was afraid that they would need many sacrifices this time, so Owen should try his best to convince them. Owen tensed up, but still decided to ask one more thing. When he heard that, Shunan looked at him incredulously and asked him what he wanted. Owen didn't say right away and started by saying that he realizes it's a complicated request, but he thinks it would be a good idea to bring at least a few bows to the next negotiation to exchange. Hearing this made Shunan grimace with anger. Giving his opponent weapons was definitely not in his plans. The next day, a delegation of frogmen arrived at the Lizardman village with many supplies and gifts. The tribal leaders and their warriors chatted peacefully among themselves. One of the lizardmen marveled at the incredibly strong piece of leather to his eyes. It was incredible, and he could not believe that it was a simple gift. Could the frogmen really produce them so easily? At the same time, sitting on the packaged healing herbs, Rockrock declared that these herbs were effective against itching. He was offering all this considerable quantity in exchange for just one bow. Owen looked at their quantity and realized that they must have gathered all the medicinal plants in the area, pretending to think about the offer. Shunin replied that no. Rather than saying, there isn't enough, he said that trading weapons is difficult. After all, it's difficult with a certain level of faith. Rakrak sighed and thought, that's it again. And after a moment's thought, he came up with something. Rakrak formally addressed the frogman leader, saying, Shunan, a son of the great Alroy, for the sake of the faith of both tribes, I have a request to make. His request was a little strange and unexpected. Rockrock wanted to speak to Owen, separately and personally. Shunan looked at his captive with a smile and simply replied, do whatever you want. They seemed to be playing their roles well, and nothing wrong could be seen behind their smiles. But that was not the case. Rockrock wanted to find out what was wrong with them and what the lizard man was hiding, so he led him away from earshot. Their conversation began with Owen telling them that their tribe had joined the tribe of the frogmen through a ritual of brotherhood. Rockrock wondered what that ritual was, but Owen replied that it was a long way off and that they still had plenty of time to get to know each other well. So he asked to tell him all about their tribe, and then he would provide them with as much information about the frogmen as possible. Owen tried to be as friendly as possible and suggested to Rockrock to put aside all doubts and come closer. However, Rockrock noticed a blue butterfly that he already knew, which immediately gave him certain thoughts, but still, he didn't understand why it was here. When it landed on Owen's head, it was clear that Rockrock had to lure him to his side and use him. Owen himself did not understand anything and only asked what this strange butterfly was. After looking at the flying butterfly, Rack finally decided to play a dangerous game. He told Owen that, indeed, there were many doubts and suspicions between them now, so it should be put to an end, and now he would tell him everything about them and their story. The conversation between the two lizardmen went well back at the frogmen's settlement. Shunin praised Owen and his excellent work, patting him on the shoulder all the time. The results they had achieved with his idea were great. Shunin shrieked with joy as he told them they would come to their settlement when they said they would show them their village. Oh boy, thought they were trying to trap them, but that was just silly. Thanks to the lizards themselves, the frogmen were able to find out the location and size of the village. They even learned some information about their history, even contrary to what the scout had said, that the tribe consisted of 600 men. In reality, there were at most 300, of which only 30 were warriors. The Shunan's guard summarized the heir to the chieftain himself. Had not thought they would trust them, but it was only thanks to Owen that all this had been realized. For such excellent results, Shunan was ready to fulfill any wish of Owen. However, there was a single request for Shunan that Owen had asked for more than once. Shunan asked him what he was talking about, to which Owen shortly reminded him about the promise to let the children go if Owen did the right thing. Shunan promised to let them live together. Oh boy, having heard such a promise, questioned the chief. Did he really say such a thing? To this, Shunan advised him not to be so cruel. His father also understood they shouldn't be so cruel to the lizardmen. He reminded the guard they needed to show the lizardmen that good things would happen if they were served faithfully. Don't be afraid, Owen. I remember the promise, said Shunan, sending him away. Owen was indeed grateful to him for this. The evening came very slowly, with anticipation in his chest. Owen looked at the cage with children from the small slope. Now more than ever before, he wanted to live with his child. However, with the feeling of joy the cats were scratching at his soul, he didn't understand what the problem was. After all, it was natural selection drawing symbols in the sand. He whispered quietly that it was only the fault of the foolish tribe leader of lizardmen, the one called Rockrock. He should have been more suspicious and careful in his movements. Owen frowned. The last time they had met, the leader had shown something amazing that he hadn't seen before. Different signs that complemented each other. It's called writing. Rockrak explained he and his tribe had figured out how to use them. Different symbols represented different meanings. Whether it was home or food, two crossed-out sticks meant no, the chief said, and a sign that looked like a square root they called a lie or a fake. Owen seemed to dive headfirst into science. He began to ask if two letters could be written so close together. He explained his thoughts by saying that if you put them together, they would be "don't lie." The delighted Rockrak said with a smile on his face that he had never thought about it and praised Owen, calling him a clever lizard. To this, he brushed it off, saying that it was a huge praise for him. For some reason, at this moment of praise, he was reminded of Shunan's words when he had called him a smart charlatan. It even became a little hurtful when he came back to reality. However, he realized that the lizard chief had never told Shunan about the writings. He didn't seem to want to show that knowledge to Frogman. But why had he revealed it to Owen, as if reading his mind? Rakrak said it was all just because of faith. The faith that they had used so far between the members of the Lizardman tribe and the Alroy tribe of Frogmen was different. But contrary to that, the only thing he was really interested in was the trust between him and Owen. Owen was visibly crumpling his eyebrows and speaking incoherently. He tried to convey that there was peace between the toads and the lizards, but the leader of the lizardmen interrupted him. He told Owen in a calm voice that he did not believe the information he had told him about the frogmen. There seemed to him to be more hidden in that story than was told Rak, and his lizard tribe had known pain as well. They had seen well the creatures that had fallen by the wayside of life and been cast out. They were just like Owen. They had seen more than once the face of a suffering. A stinging tear rolled down Owen's cheek, that he himself didn't notice how moved he was by the words. "Am I wrong?" Rak asked, calmly, confident in his words, to which Owen replied that it was nothing, and asked if he had anything else to say. However, Rakrach didn't need anything else. He had already seen the signs of faith. That's what Owen was thinking about as he looked off into the distance at the river. The leader of the Lizardman tribe seemed very confident at that moment, but still, it was simply impossible to defeat so many frogmen, and evil spirit Rak even bragged to Owen about defeating a huge ancient Scalopendra, but that seemed useless against those who had beheld and survived against really horrible monsters. The lizards didn't even know how to use a bow, let alone the secret weapons that frogmen warriors have. So carefree that they even talked about their problems without thinking about the consequences. It was a foolish decision. They shouldn't have trusted such a despicable man. Owen summarized getting up from the ground. Even though he'd said he shouldn't be trusted, they kept doing it, driving him the wall. Owen thought he himself was just a charlatan. After one last look at the inscriptions he had been drawing in the sand, he turned around and went back to his tent. By morning, almost all the symbols had disappeared, hiding the fact that someone had been there. A huge commotion went up in the village. A multitude of feet ran from the side, raising a huge amount of dust. Lizardmen arrived in their settlement, shouting out things here and there. Shunan came out to greet them with open arms. To this Rakrak, thanked them for such friendly hospitality. He hoped that this exchange would only strengthen the friendship between the two tribes. Shunan also supported his guest's wish. All the lizards came in full gear, spears in hand. Rak was ahead of all questions, and asked them to ignore the fact that they had come with weapons, explaining that he was afraid they would meet Cockatrice halfway. Shunan only mentally gloated at the foolish lizardmen leader. He thought the idiot wouldn't even believe him if he told him that Cockatrice could not be fought with a spear. Shunan was cunning enough to even think of a plan ahead of time when the banquet began. He was going to get his guest drunk and fire a poison arrow. Rakrak was distracted at this time and asked where Owen was, to which the son of the frogman chieftain shouted at the top of his voice for Owen to appear immediately. He was standing not far from where the banquet was being held and seemed to be drawing something on the ground. There were only lined paths on which the dishes were placed. Crates and bags of food were visible in the background. They seemed to have decided where Rockrak would sit. Sit there. Shunin pointed ahead and asked him to say hello to Owen, and he went to make sure the food was cooked properly. So be it, the lizard replied, pulling a smile onto his face. Getting close enough to him, Rak called out to Owen, who was waiting for him to come in his place. Owen wrote some text that needed to be read when Rak and the warriors are seated. The banquet will begin, Owen said with a smile to the lizard chief. It sounded like a warning of danger. Owen, however, with his feigned smile, went on to say that it was a fun banquet that would promote peace and friendship between the two tribes. While he was saying all this, he was pointing his stick at his text, which consisted of only one symbol that Raycrack had taught him Lime. They were written all along the length of the seats on which the chief and warriors were to be seated. Taking the hint, Raycrack began to pull the water buffalo's skull over his head while calling out to Yor. The lizard's pupils became as narrow as a cat's, and with anger in his voice, he ordered the warriors to begin. Yor waited for nothing more. Gathering all the strength in his hand, he took masterful aim with his spear. The weapon flew straight into the frog warrior's head. The spear pierced through the skull, causing the body to fall to the ground. Terrifying. The others kill all the frogmen. Rockrak ordered his tribe in a cold and low tone. The warriors moved forward, without hesitation. One by one, the frogs fell to the ground, pinned with spears. They didn't even have time to do anything with their bows. Some of the defeated green creatures turned to Owen before they died, blaming him for he knew everything, branding him a traitor, and blaming him for their deaths. Rakrak's casual face expressed no emotion, only drops of blood dripping from his mask, leaving a trail. In a short time, the entire clearing was strewn with the bodies of frogmen holding arrows on their belts that had not saved their lives. Rakrak walked around the area, listening to the report on the progress of the attack. During the attack on the warriors, many of the frogmen had fled, following Shunan's example, which meant that they would soon be hit by a hail of arrows. We don't need worry about the arrows, because we have a backup plan. One of the warriors said to the leader, but that was unnecessary, for they had Owen Rakrak said, with a smile on his face, there was something in his plans that he had to do. The tip of the arrow the frogman held was coated with some kind of poison. Shunan and the warriors he'd gathered in the meantime, armed with bows, were heading toward the banquet site where the black-scale lizards would be. He was mad as hell and blamed Owen, who in his opinion was to blame for what was happening. Turning to his warriors, he asked irritably if they had passed on his orders, to which one of his subordinates replied that they had. He reported that he had summoned all the warriors of the village and put them under the command of the Oboy warrior and ordered them to attack the black-scaled lizards, while the lizards in the village were ordered to hold back those until reinforcements arrived. Hearing this, Shunan angrily shouted that they should avenge such meanness from those pointing his finger at the black-scale lizards. He shouted furiously and ordered his men to fire and destroy the enemy at all costs. In the very next instant, a rain of poisonous arrows flew straight towards the Rakrak tribe. Even if the arrow could not kill the lizard, it would still die from the poison. However, they also had a trump card in the form of the shields each warrior was armed with. The next moment, the arrows hit the shields and fell to the ground with a clang. Shunan and the rest of his warriors were amazed at what they had seen, for they could not have imagined that the Black Scale tribe would have anything to counter them, and even more so, that they could neutralize one of their strongest weapons, and one of the weapons of which they were so proud, namely, their bows. Rakrak and his warriors rejoiced that they had won a small victory. Shunan was angry at his failure, but not about to give up. He ordered his warriors to keep firing if they saw them trying to advance the next moment. However, his attention was drawn to the smoke that appeared out of nowhere. Puzzled, he wondered what was happening. He looked again at where the black-scale lizards were, and found that he could no longer see them properly because of the smoke, which would greatly reduce the effectiveness of their bows. However, there was still one more question, and that was, where was the smoke coming from? At the same time, in the lower village of Frogmen, someone had set buildings on fire with a torch. It was none other than Owen who, with torch in hand, stood watching the fire spread throughout the house. His kin ran up to him and began to panic, asking why he was burning down the village. Seeing that he did not answer, one of them asked if it was also Shunan order. Owen replied that it was not, but that he had been asked to do so by the leader of the black-scale lizards. Hearing this, his kin were perplexed and shocked, as they could not understand why he had decided to listen to their enemy. Seeing their confusion and panic, Owen told them to calm down and trust him, then informed them that the black-scale lizards intended to crush the frogs. The gray-scale lizards were silent. Owen was the smartest among them, and they realized that even if this trickster risked everything, they should do the same. The tips of the lizards' wooden clubs caught fire, and in the next instant, the village of Frogmen was engulfed in flames. Shunan watched with shock and despair as his village burned. He still could not believe that Owen could betray him, seeing that the grayscale lizards had betrayed them and that their situation was getting worse and worse. Shunan gave his warriors the command to retreat, to which they asked how they could retreat when they had killed their warriors. However, Shunan's priority was his safety, for if heir like him got into trouble, it would most likely be all over for the village. However, since it was the heir's order, they could not disobey so grudgingly. They began to prepare to withdraw. Turning to Shunan, one of them asked if they would join the Oboy warrior. However, he himself did not know the exact answer to this question. Although he had no doubts about his abilities, his intuition told him that in order to get rid of the black-scale lizards, he needed a more reliable way. At the same time, Oboy was confused as the village burned, while there was no word from the warriors preparing for the feast. By his assumptions, Shunan must have been continuing to fight. However, the problem was that the 10 warriors who were in the banquet hall, as well as the 5 others who went to check, were most likely dead. This left Shunan with about 15 more warriors, while there should have been 4 or 5 more on the island. Adding them together, and adding his 10 warriors, as well as the warriors from the upper-class village, the total should have been somewhere around 45, which meant that they still had the advantage. Instead of panicking, he began to encourage his warriors by telling them to put more poison on their arrows. After all they had to do was wait for Shunan to arrive, with whom they would retreat. But despite his confident words, his warrior intuition warned him of the approaching danger, and as it turned out, his intuition was not lying. The very next moment, a noise was heard in the bushes nearby. Quickly reacting, he immediately pointed his bow in the direction of the noise, shouting for those who was sitting there to come out, threatening to shoot him. But behind his determination and threats was fear. He had the same feeling he had when he met Cockatrice, and his instincts told him to run, but he could not do so for the next instant. 2 large eyes flashed through the bushes on seeing them. Oboy immediately ordered his warriors to shoot at them. The warriors released the bowstrings of their bows, and the arrows flew at the enemy. But in the next instant, the faces of all Frogman's Grodes, who saw what appeared before them, were filled with fear and horror. Before them was a huge reptile, on the back of which sat several black-scale lizards. The creature with an arrow between its teeth seemed to be smiling at them. The lizard behind Joel asked her if the arrow had wounded Manun, to which she smiled and said that it was probably just stuck between his teeth. Manun was still small and still had a habit of chewing everything in his mouth. But this was not the case with the arrow, and he immediately spat it out with a disgruntled look. Whether because the arrow was not tasty enough, or for some other reason, he let out a furious growl. The next moment, Jael pointed to the frightened and desperate frogmen and asked that, hadn't they been a good meal for him? Frogmen, not wanting to die, turned to their commander, Oboy, in a panic, asking what they should do, since arrows did not damage the creature. However, he himself did not know what to do. They had no time to think of a better plan for the next moment. Manan jumped on Oboy, who was closest to him. He was an experienced warrior, and a second before he died, he managed to dodge, which put the head of his inexperienced kin right in the reptile's mouth. realizing that this monster was no match for cockatrice and that it was almost impossible to make eye contact with such a fast creature. He decided to throw poisonous toads into its jaws. Manoon, like a dog, seeing a bone thrown to him, instantly caught it and swallowed it, thinking that maybe the reptile was vulnerable to poison. Oh Boy shouted to his warriors to throw all the poisonous toads they had, which they immediately did not, about to give up the free tasty snacks. Manoon began to catch the toads flying at him, watching this performance with disdain. Jowl asked the lizard behind her what they were doing, to which he replied that they were throwing poisonous toads from their pouches. But she said that she had seen it herself. But what she was more interested in was why they were throwing their snacks around, which she thought was very strange. After a moment's thought, he replied that perhaps it was an act of goodwill. Jowl grinned wickedly at this, then turned to Manoon and told him to explain that it was too late for that. One of the blessings they had received from the god was the blessing of resistance to poisons, which was crucial at the moment, seeing the evil smirk on Manon's face, who was looking at him like he was lunch. Oh Boy realized that his foolproof plan had failed, but there was no time to do anything about it, for in the next instant, the huge reptile leapt at him again, and this time without missing a beat. In the Frogman village, traces of blood could be seen everywhere on the ground, while their houses burned with fire. A frogman sitting in the bushes with a bow was aiming at someone. In the next instant, the arrow was speeding through the air towards its target, which was Rak, who was walking somewhere. However, even though he could not see the arrow coming at him, thanks to his excellent instincts, he was able to sense the approaching danger and reflected it with his massive tail, while Ur, who had arrived in time, neutralized the archer with a single blow. When he approached Rak, he informed him that it looked like this frogman had been the last, adding that Shunin had indeed abandoned the village and fled when he sensed danger, to which Rak replied that one of the reasons for this was the betrayal of the grayscale lizards who were currently fighting against the frogmen with them, then adding that even so, they had no right to criticize them as it was their choice. However, what he was really interested in, and what he thought was really strange, it was why, despite the criticality of their situation, the great Alroy they had only heard about did not show up. Sunwoon, who was watching them from above, smiled, pleased with himself, then quietly muttered to himself that it was all because of him. Among the countless tactics and strategies used by him, there was one that was probably one of the strongest in the game, and it was called disease. It worked and was effective in any era. It was a tactic he decided to use this time, even though he had some trouble finding the right virus, since it was only supposed to work on the mucous membranes of amphibians. He still managed to do it, the time when Rak followed Stargazer to the southeast, where the tribe of frogmen was located, coincided with the time when Sun and Youth. Woon discovered the virus, and even though the virus and the frogman tribe were hundreds of kilometers apart, he successfully managed to transport it to them, thanks to his insect army, who, despite many casualties along the way, eventually made it to their village where he first infected their leader, the great Alroy, who has since disappeared. At the same time, the sounds of drums could be heard around the island, banged by several frogmen on the ground near the water. Several bound, grayscale lizard cubs were kneeling, realizing they were here for sacrifice. They tearfully awaited their fate. Not far away, on the ground, sat the great Alroy, whose body was covered with a layer of white slime, and who had initiated the sacrifice that he believed would heal them, together with a crowd of his tribesmen who knelt before the lizard cubs, bowed and begged the two-headed god to accept their sacrifice and to kill all those lizards, thus showing them his greatness. Soon, someone's huge shadow appeared under the water, with two pairs of eyes glowing in it. At the same time, Shunan reached the island by boat and saw that his father had already started the ritual of the sacrifice, which he believed was the key to their victory. At the same time, in the nearly destroyed lower village of the frogmen, Rak was called loudly by someone's excited and panting voice. Turning around, he saw Owen, who was breathing heavily from running, praising Owen for a job well done. Rakrak asked him why he was in such a hurry and what he wanted from him. He said with desperation in his voice that they needed to get to the island right away. Rakrak was puzzled as to why they had to get to the island now, and he said that the frogmen had lizard cubs there to sacrifice. Then he added that they had a god, and that if they sacrificed to him, he would come and do them a small favor, and though he might not be able to cure their disease, he would probably attack Rock and his warriors. Rakrak sighed and said that he should have told him about it earlier, for now they had no way to get to the island, for Shunan had taken all the boats in his escape. Owen did not want to give up and started to say that if they swam, they would be able to get to the island. But he was immediately interrupted by the harsh voice of Rakrak, who looked at him coldly and said that it was too dangerous because they had bows and they didn't swim as well as they did. Owen's eyes filled with despair at these words, and in the next instant, his fatherly instinct kicked in, making him beg him to help his son and the other kids. However, this only made Rakrak angrier, who immediately punched him in the jaw. He shouted at him furiously, saying that he should have confided in him earlier and told him everything from the beginning. Then he told Owen, who looked at him with horror and despair on his face, that he believed that they could defeat the god the stupid frogs believed in by their own strength, and that if their god appeared and attacked them, he would show him how they could destroy him. When he calmed down and stopped shouting, he looked pettingly at the still sobbing Owen. Though he couldn't imagine his pain, he knew it was incredibly hard for him, so he just asked if he thought he should have told him earlier so they could have saved his son at the same time. Zhao stopped behind them, and after dealing with Oboy, she got back on Mainin. She immediately turned her worried gaze to the island in the middle of the lake. Owen didn't think Rakrak had said anything wrong, for he realized that things would have changed if he had only been able to learn of Shunan's intentions earlier, and perhaps if he hadn't acted so late, none of this would have happened. In the next instant, the water near the island was churning all. Roy, shouting incomprehensible words, joyfully reached out to the creature that appeared from under the water. This creature turned out to be a two-headed devil, which was their god without wasting time. Alroy immediately pointed to the gray lizard cubs, who, seeing the monster, clung to each other in fear, and then he said in a reverent voice that it was his offering. Raising his hands in the air, he began to shout in a fanatical voice to punish the black-scale lizards who dared to disturb the god's lake. Looking at the huge, two-headed monster that looked invincible to him, Owen finally lost hope. However, while he resigned himself to his fate, Rakrak, along with Jaol, looked at the two-headed devil with calm gazes despite its enormous size. Rakrak thought that fighting this huge two-headed serpent might be worth a try. After all, even though they didn't have a location advantage and couldn't use any tricks, they had a chance to win, even if it cost some sacrifices. However, the very next instant, he noticed something that made his eyes widen, wide and glow. A butterfly flew towards him, glowing with a blue light. This could only mean one thing. They had hope. Walking over to the desperate Owen, Rakrak called out to him and told him to look at him. He raised his head in bewilderment and looked at him with his tear-wet eyes, which widened. The next moment, at what he saw standing in front of the huge mantis that appeared before them in the moonlight. Rakrak turned to Owen and asked him if he believed in miracles. Kneeling before his god Alroy, shouted loudly to his tribe to worship the two-headed devil. He again began fanatically shouting to the monster to accept their offerings and destroy the lizards. Shunan bowed his head and watched as monster approached the victims, but at one point, the monster stopped in indecision and looked forward with Alroy's experience. This god had always been hungry for sacrifices, and always as if he had been starving for days had rushed at them. But to his surprise, this time, no such thing had happened. Wishing to know what monster was looking at, he followed his gaze and turned around cautiously. His eyes widened at what he saw, and he instinctively froze with fear. There was a large shadow above the tall trees belonging to a huge creature with large eyes, which, at the mere sight of it, inspired awe and terror. The sounds of this creature's movements were accompanied by the cracking sound of trees bursting out of the ground. "You, ground," which immediately made the frogmen bowing to the two-headed devil turn around, like their leader. They also froze with fear when they saw the creature approaching them, shivering in fear. Someone from the crowd loudly exclaimed, "It's new God." Their fear was understandable. Go back to the two-headed demon who was confused and furious when he saw the creature approaching him, because if he let the creature that had invaded his territory stay, he would have to give up frogmen and sacrifices. And so even though his opponent seemed large and strong, he was not one of his arms. The mantis easily, Roy and Shunin, who were watching, had a look of horror on their faces. Then grabbing the serpent's remaining head, which was still showing signs of life, the mantis said he would offer it to his creator so that he could atone for his stupidity, for his stupidity was not a sin. In the next moment, illuminated by the bright light of the moon, he pompously tore off its head. Then, under the gaze of all present, turning to the dead serpent, he said that his sins were forgiven by his blood. Message that appeared after his choice made him unconsciously smile. After all, it said that he had obtained a small patch of water. However, the only problem was that he didn't need it now, because the lake had no access to the sea, which made him decide to put it aside for now. A boat pulled away from the shore. The lake was water red with blood in it, sat Roy, still trying to believe the truth of what was happening. Shunan looked at his father, who seemed to have lost his mind after the death of the serpent. He thought to himself that it was not the disease that had made his father weak. It was the fact that they were completely enchanted by the power of the two-headed devil, who at that moment seemed invincible to them, and at the last moment they did nothing but hide behind him, and when he lost there was nothing left for them to do. At the same time, Sunwin approached the mantis, who, seeing him and addressing him as the creator, said that he had done his will, to which he continued to look at the island and replied that he had indeed done an excellent job. Then he added that he could rest until the next time he called him. Disappearing, Mantis said in a respectful voice that he would do his creator's will again when the time was right. He looked once more at the lake, which was silent. Sunwoon turned his gaze to Rak Rak and said that he was not the kind of lizard who did nothing at times like this. Seeing the surviving frogmen fleeing in boats to the upper village, Rak Rak cheered his warriors and shouted that they would win a complete victory today. Then asked if there were any volunteers to take them to the upper village of the frogmen. He was immediately approached by Owen, who said that he wasn't that tired yet, and that he needed to meet his son on the island anyway, and said he would do so. But he was not the only one. The next moment, several more gray lizards asked Rak Rak to let him help them as a thank you. He looked at them and replied that their bodies were not fit for battle and they would not be able to fight, to which one of them replied that he too had once been a warrior, adding that warriors were not the only ones capable of killing frogmen. Then pointing to his kin, who, despite their wounds, were willing to fight, even with sticks in their hands, he said that he might think it was cowardice of them to do so only now, but the sight of them fighting made their hearts burn. The first time they had felt that way since becoming slaves looking at them, Rak Rak replied that it was like a grudge, to which the gray lizard tearfully replied that it was for the hatred and resentment of losing their life companions. Children and grandchildren made them wish the frogmen dead. As he looked around at the gray lizards once more, he realized that few of them had ever held a real weapon, let alone been wounded. But understanding their pain and bitterness, he could not stop them. So in the next instant, he raised his fist and shouted loudly, telling all those who wanted revenge to follow him, followed by the screams of the lizards who were intent on finishing off their abusers once and for all. Rak Rak, along with Jael and Ewer and the rest of the lizards, began to swim across the lake, and soon all 80 lizards that followed their leader had reached the island. Owen was one of the first to get out of the water. He rushed straight to his cub and gave him a big hug, watching the happy and somewhat tearful reunion of father and son. Rak Rak turned to Yor and told him to send those who were tired on the journey with their children back to the boats, and afterwards to take those who could not swim well and take them to the end of the village to attract the attention of the enemy, who must now be watching closely and waiting for their attack. When he heard this, he asked admiringly if their plan was to use one of the squads as a distraction while the main group swam around the water and stabbed them in the back. To which he replied that it was realizing that Rockrak was taking the hardest part. Yor asked a little worriedly if they would be able to get to the island by water without being seen, to which he replied that they would, as the number of those who were able to fight had dwindled considerably, and there were no more than 10 of them left. After a moment's silence, he added that while they were sailing to the island, he had discovered another blessing from the god. Then, turning his gaze to the lake, which reflected the bright light of the moon, he said that their scales would shimmer in the moonlight as the water shimmered, making them much more invisible. Now that they had everything ready, all they had to do was get it over with, once and for all. After a while, all hell really broke loose in the Frogman village. Rakrak's successful plan had worked, and the frogs were taken by surprise, and realizing that they could not win, began to flee in panic. However, not everyone managed to escape, because those who suffered from itching disease and had problems with breathing could not do it. The great leader, Alroy, was no exception. As he looked in despair and incomprehension at the lizards in front of him, who appeared as if from nowhere, the realization of what was about to happen to him brought a look of horror to his face. Soon, the lizardmen warriors arrived and reached his guards, who were left to protect him. But as it turned out, they didn't stand a chance against the strong and sharp, spear-wielding lizardmen who dispatched them in the blink of an eye, so fast that the frogmen didn't even have time to fire their bows at them after killing all the guards. Rakrak looked at the lone Alroy with a cold stare. But even in such a situation, and having long since lost his dignity, he began to scream in despair, accusing the two-headed devil of not saving him despite the sacrifices he had made. But his cries did not last long, for in the next instant, the spear of the reluctant Rakrak was thrust into him, thus ending once and for all the great leader, Alroy, who despite his big name was nothing more than an empty man blaming others for his failures. At the same time, Shunan sat in his tent listening to the war cries of the lizards, as well as the panicked cries of his kin, with terror on his face, shivering with fear. He pondered how it could have happened like this, and how their numerical and weapon advantage had vanished in the blink of an eye. Even the poison that should have been their trump card did not work on the lizards, who were somehow immune to it, but it was too late to think about it because they had already lost after a while. The shouting and noise outside subsided. Deciding that this might be a good chance to escape, he cautiously peeked out of the hut to make sure that there was really no one outside. However, he didn't even realize that the danger was closer than he had imagined. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind him, causing Shunan to freeze in place with fear. In the next instant, he turned around in panic. At the same time, reaching for his quiver, which, unfortunately for him, was empty of arrows, staring with his eyes wide with fear, he shouted the name of the lizard in front of him in desperation. It was Rockrak. Looking at him with a cold stare, he told Shunan if he was a warrior, he should stand up and bear his sword, as it would at least allow him to keep his honor. However, the man had no honor now, and all he could do was just beg to be spared. He immediately panicked and started reminiscing about how they had strengthened their friendship over the last few times they had met, adding that he had no animosity towards the lizards. Rockrak asked thoughtfully if that was true, and he replied that it was because it was the two-headed devil that had threatened them. Seeing that the lizard still seemed unconvinced by his words, Shuning pointed to his bow in a panic, saying he would reveal its secret. To which Rakrak indifferently and coldly asked what the secret was. He immediately replied that it was the bowstring. And when the lizard asked him what the bowstring was made of, he replied with a playful smile that it was made of veins from the backs of frogmen. Rakrak, like Owen, was really shocked at what he had heard, and his face immediately darkened. Even though he had assumed that the bowstrings were made from some animals, he had never imagined that they were made from their kin. The next moment, he asked Shunin, who was sitting in front of him with a smile on his face, what the bow itself was made of. The man, realizing what he was about to say, mumbled that it was from lizards. Shunan lowered his head and prepared to die, for he knew that after his words, he would not be released. Rock heard the answer and replied in a cold and grim voice that he understood. Then, opening the curtain at the entrance to the hut and looking out, he said that there were really no hard feelings between them, and he had already won a brilliant victory. So he accepted the deal he had offered. He then looked at Shunan and added that he was free to go. Shunan looked around warily and rose to his feet, still not fully believing that he was being let go. Not waiting for Rock to change his mind, he started to run away. Owen, who was standing next to Rock, asked him if he was really going to let him go. Rock took his bow and arrow and said yes. Then, taking aim at the fleeing Shunan, he coldly added that all he needed was a moving target. Not long after the frogmen were finished, Raycrack's arrow whistled through the air. It hit the head of a bound, rotting, and long-dead frogman. Judging by the number of marks, it had long been used as a target for training. Now, Rakra was pleased with the result. His archery skills had improved greatly, and their tribe had found a way to make bows as good as the frogmen. However, he just wondered if this was the best they could do. Even Owen, who had been watching the training, had noticed that the quality of this bow was just as good as the frogmen's, and its arrows flew just as fast and far. Rakrock explained to him that they had achieved all this by replacing the material of the bowstring with frogman tendons. But still, the lizards were physically stronger than the frogmen and could pull the bowstring tighter and risk breaking such a bow, so they should have found stronger materials. Owen understood his desire for a better weapon, but he still reminded him that the bows made by the frogmen were the best that could be made in this forest. There just weren't any better materials here. That's true, Rack said, nodding. Then I guess we can't just stay in this forest. Then, Owen was smart, so he assumed that the reason for this decision wasn't just to make a better bow, and that was indeed the case. Rack explained to Owen that he had learned from the Stargazer that this forest area would become very cold as winter came. The lizards would become physically weaker, but would still be able to survive the winter by making fires and wearing the skin of other animals. The problem, however, was their pet, water buffaloes. Rack knew that in nature, water buffalo go to warmer places to avoid winter and find places with enough grass. And to solve this problem, some of them will have to go to warmer places to breed water buffalo. Further, you may have noticed by now that Owen had a skull on his head that was different from those worn by Rock warriors. There were no warriors among the grayscale lizards, but there were definitely those that had the right qualities and abilities to become warriors. Rock had tested and selected them himself, and Owen was one of the gray lizards who had become warriors after passing several tests. These new warriors insisted on using frogmen skulls rather than buffalo skulls, and Rock allowed them to do so. Rock continued practicing and shooting at the target, hitting one arrow after another. Finally, he asked Owen about the results of today's hunt. He replied contentedly that he and his squad had wiped out the remnants of the frogmen hiding in the forest nearby, and now, thanks to their carcasses, there would be no shortage of materials for making bows. Rock was pleased to hear that, however. Owen still couldn't forget what had happened in the village, how he and the other lizardmen, blinded by hatred and rage, had pursued and killed the unarmed and begging for mercy frogmen. Nothing seemed to quench their thirst for vengeance, and their last victim that night was Shunan, who had betrayed his tribe and revealed its secrets and then tried to escape. It was not a pleasant memory, and he was brought out of it by Rack question. He asked Owen what was bothering him. Owen replied that he would like to have Shunan or Alroy's skull as a reward for helping him someday, and asked that the skull not be damaged in training. Rack was fine with that, and promised him that he would be sure to get his strength. Owen was grateful for that, and decided to tell him about an interesting place they had discovered in the forest while hunting. Jewel, meanwhile, came over and quietly leaned over the gray lizard cub who was watching the leader with an unusual figure in his hands. Jael asked quietly, interested in listening to the adults. She frightened the cub. He immediately burst into tears and let go of the figure. Then Jewel asked him what he was doing here and what he wanted to ask the chief. Suddenly, she noticed a figure lying on the grass. She picked it up and asked what it was. It looked suspiciously like the giant praying mantis that their god had sent to help them. Jael showed the figure to Rock, and he also thought the figure looked like their divine protector. They all liked the way the figure was made, and the chief even asked the cub if he had made it himself. Rock praised him, saying that the figure was nice and cute. Hearing this, the cub just glowed with happiness, and then he offered to keep the figure as a gift. But Rock was not sure whether it was worth taking the toy away from the child, and looked questioningly at Owen. He replied that it was fine, and he could accept the gift without any regrets. For the children of his village had been making a lot of them lately. It is even popular among them to exchange such figures. Hearing this, Joel asked the child if there were many children in their village who knew how to make such figures, and he answered her that yes. He explained that it all started because the protector had then saved them all on the island from imminent doom. Now all the children of their village thought of him as a good and powerful being who could protect them from any misfortune. Hearing this, Rock and Jael looked at each other. Rock realized that these figures could be very useful and decided to see how many had been made so far and buy them all. Owen offered to go to their village and see. Rock agreed. He was willing to use all his resources to get more of these figurines. He saw this as an opportunity to spread the belief in their unnamed bug god, but that would come later. For now, Rock wanted to know what Owen's squad had found during the hunt. It turned out that while hunting the frogmen, they had found a strange structure inside one of the caves where some of the frogmen were hiding. It takes about half a day to get there from the lake, and their squad killed all the enemies without much trouble, but the cave was a bit strange. Rack was immediately interested and asked what he meant. Strange in what sense? Owen explained that when they entered the cave, they noticed that there was another entrance that seemed to be carved into the stone, and he himself still doesn't understand how they were able to carve something into solid rock. So he thought then that all should be told to the tribal chief first. It was the right decision. And Rack decided to equip an expedition and explore everything with his own eyes. He returned to the village with Owen and Joel to take a group of warriors with him, and together with them, he set off. Wait, please wait. Hear me out. If you enjoy this video, how about you subscribe, like, and hit that notification button so that you will be able to be notified when I upload another video.